You wake up dead. Not metaphorically, literally. The man sleeping next to you, the one who shared stories about his village last night, who laughed at a joke someone told, who said he'd write home if he ever got the chance. He's not breathing anymore. His eyes are open, staring at nothing. His body is already cold and rigid in the pre-dawn darkness. You have about 30 seconds before you need to decide. Do you tell the overseer? Do you help drag the body away? Or do you pretend you didn't notice, because acknowledging death means acknowledging that tomorrow, next week, next month, that body could be yours? In a few hours, other workers will drag him to a shallow grave near the wall he spent months building. No ceremony, no prayers. No one will speak his name again. His family, hundreds of miles away, will never know when or how he died. He'll just be missing forever. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't some terrible accident or worst-case scenario. This was Tuesday. This was normal. This was the cost of doing business on the Great Wall of China. Now here's the question that should make your blood run cold. What if I told you that all this death, every broken body, every destroyed family, every million lives consumed, was for nothing? What if the thing they died building never even worked? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand exactly what happened here, because the Great Wall of China isn't just a monument, it's a crime scene. And once you know what really happened, you'll never look at it the same way again. And yet somehow, against mathematics and mercy and every reasonable expectations of human endurance, some people survived. How? Why? And what does their suffering tell us about what we're willing to sacrifice for monuments we build? But here's the question we'll return to, the one that should haunt every moment of this story. What if it was all for nothing? What if the monument they died building never accomplished its stated purpose? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we walk through what these workers experienced, because the answer will change how you see everything. This is the story you've never heard about the Great Wall of China, not the romantic vision of noble craftsmen creating a wonder of the world. The truth was far darker, far more brutal, and far more human. The wall wasn't just built with stone and earth and brick. It was built with flesh and blood and bone. It was built with suffering on a scale that's hard for us to comprehend from our comfortable distance in time. You probably imagine you could handle it. You're strong, resilient, capable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You wouldn't last a single day. Neither would I. Neither would almost anyone living in our modern world. And by the time we're done tonight, you'll understand exactly why. Let me give you the numbers. And then let me tell you why they don't even begin to capture the horror. Historical records from various dynasties document the scale of conscription with chilling precision. During the Qin Dynasty around 221 BC, approximately 300,000 soldiers and 500,000 civilians were mobilized, roughly 20% of China's entire population at the time, according to later Han Dynasty chronicles. To put that in modern perspective, imagine if tomorrow, 1 in 5 people in your country were forcibly conscripted for a single construction project. The social disruption would be catastrophic. In ancient China, it was policy. The northern Qin Dynasty conscripted 1.8 million people. The Sui Dynasty forced about 1 million workers into service. These weren't volunteers. They were conscripts, criminals, and soldiers who had zero choice in the matter. But here's the first reveal that changes everything. During Qin Shi Huang's reign alone, historical sources indicate approximately 130,000 people died, a mortality rate of roughly 10% over the construction period. Think about that. 1 in 10 workers dead. In modern construction, a single worker death triggers investigations, lawsuits, potential shutdowns. In ancient China, 10% mortality was just the cost of doing business. Acceptable losses. a line item in imperial budgets. And that's just one dynasty, one construction period spanning 9 years. The wall was built over more than 2,500 years by multiple dynasties. When historians extrapolate from the fragmented records that survive, using mortality rates documented in various sources and comparing them to similar forced labor projects throughout Chinese history, the total death toll across all construction periods likely exceeded 1 million people. 1 million dead, their names lost, their families destroyed, their suffering calculated and accepted by emperors who never got their own hands dirty. But here's the thing that should absolutely enrage you, and I want you to hold on to this rage because we're going to need it later. What if all that death was for nothing? What if the thing they died building never even worked? Keep that question simmering in the back of your mind. We'll return to it. Think about that for a moment. 1 million dead. And that's likely a conservative estimate. Many bodies were buried hastily near the wall or at construction sites because transporting corpses took time and labor that overseers preferred to spend on construction. This practice gave rise to one of China's most enduring pieces of folklore, the legend that workers were literally built into the wall itself. The truth here is more nuanced than the legend. Archaeological excavations have never actually confirmed the presence of human remains embedded within the wall structure itself. The bodies in the wall story appears to be metaphorical rather than literal. But bodies have been found buried in shallow graves near construction sites, hasty interments of workers who collapsed and died where they fell. The legend captures a deeper truth. The wall was built on death, constructed from suffering as much as from stone. Whether bodies are physically in the wall matters less than the undeniable reality that countless lives were consumed in its construction. This grim accounting earned the Great Wall a nickname that persists in Chinese culture to this day: the longest cemetery on Earth. It's a phrase that appears in poems, folklore, and historical commentary spanning centuries, a cultural acknowledgement of the monument's human cost that contradicts any simple celebration of engineering triumph. Tonight, we're going to walk through what it was actually like to build the Great Wall of China. Not the sanitized, romanticized version you see in documentaries or travel brochures. The real thing. We'll explore how workers were conscripted, what their days looked like, what they ate or didn't eat, how they died, and why the conditions were so impossibly harsh that even the strongest among us would struggle to survive a single day of labor on that merciless stone serpent winding through the mountains. This is a story about human endurance pushed beyond its limits, about societies that viewed human life as an expendable resource in the service of empire, about the terrible cost of ambition and fear. The Great Wall stands today as one of the most recognizable monuments on Earth, drawing millions of tourists who marvel at its scale and beauty. But before we can truly appreciate it, we need to understand what it cost. We need to remember the countless individuals whose names we'll never know, whose bones lie scattered beneath stones, whose lives were consumed by a project they never chose. So settle in, let the modern world fade away, and prepare to understand why you wouldn't last a day building the Great Wall of China. The origins. When walls became an empire. Long before the Great Wall snaked its way across northern China as a single monumental structure, there were walls, many walls. During the spring and autumn period, 770 to 476 BC, and the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC, the fractured Chinese states built defensive fortifications to protect themselves from each other. These were turbulent centuries of almost constant warfare, shifting alliances, and territorial ambition. Each state, Qi, Yan, Zhao, Wei, Qin, and others, constructed its own walls, marking boundaries, defending against raids, and creating a visible manifestation of political power. These early walls were nothing like what we think of today when we picture the Great Wall. They were constructed primarily of rammed earth, a technique where workers would pound soil between wooden frames until it became hard and compact enough to serve as a barrier. In some regions, especially in mountainous areas, builders used stone. The walls were effective against the military technology of the time: swords, spears, arrows. They were never meant to be impenetrable fortresses, but rather obstacles that would slow invaders and give defenders time to mobilize. The walls served another crucial purpose beyond defense. They were symbols. They declared, "This is where our territory begins and yours ends. This is what we're willing to spend resources on. This is how seriously we take the threat you pose." In an age without clear maps or satellite imagery, physical barriers defined political reality in the most tangible way imaginable. But everything changed in 221 BC. That year, the Qin state, led by King Ying, conquered the last of the rival states and unified China for the first time in its history. Ying took a new title befitting his achievement: Qin Shi Huang, which translates to First Emperor of Qin. He was 38 years old, brutal, paranoid, brilliant, and driven by a vision of a unified China that would endure for 10,000 generations. The new emperor faced immediate problems. Yes, he had conquered the warring states and brought them under central control. But the internal walls, those barriers between what had been separate kingdoms, now threatened the unity he'd fought so hard to establish. So he ordered them torn down. The walls within China had to go. They were relics of division, and division was the enemy of empire. But there was another threat, one that wouldn't be solved by demolishing internal barriers. To the north lay the steppes of Inner Asia, home to nomadic peoples who lived by a completely different set of rules than the settled agricultural societies of China. The most significant of these groups were the Xiongnu, fierce horsemen who raided Chinese settlements for grain, metal, and luxury goods they couldn't produce themselves. They were mobile, adaptable, and dangerous. The geography itself created this conflict. Northern China sits at roughly the 15-inch isoyet, the line marking annual rainfall of 15 inches. South of this line, the climate supports settled agriculture. North of it, the semi-arid grasslands favor pastoral nomadism. Two completely different ways of life, brought into contact by geography, and both convinced the other was a threat to their survival. Qin Shi Huang decided the solution was a wall, but not just any wall. He would connect and expand the existing northern fortifications of the conquered states into a single continuous barrier that would stretch from Gansu province in the west all the way to the coast of Manchuria in the east. It would be called the Wan Li Chang Cheng, the 10,000 li-long wall. 1 li equals approximately half a kilometer, so 10,000 li would be about 5,000 kilometers or 3,100 miles. To lead this monumental project, the emperor appointed General Meng Tian, one of his most trusted military commanders. Meng Tian had proven his capabilities by leading 300,000 soldiers to drive the Xiongnu north of the Yellow River. Now those same 300,000 soldiers would be redirected to an even more grueling task: building the wall. Construction began around 214 BC. The route was carefully chosen to maximize natural defensive advantages, following mountain ridges where possible, using steep terrain to make any assault more difficult. Ancient records describe how General Meng Tian utilized the natural mountain barriers to establish the border defenses, scooping out the valleys and constructing ramparts. As written in the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. But 300,000 soldiers weren't enough. The emperor conscripted another 500,000 civilians, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, pulled from their homes and families and sent to the northern frontier. He also sent criminals. Thousands upon thousands of convicts were offered a deal. 4 years of hard labor on the wall in exchange for their sentence being commuted. Many accepted, not realizing they were choosing a different kind of death sentence. The scale was unprecedented. Nearly 1 million people working across thousands of miles of the most challenging terrain imaginable. Mountains that rose steeply from valley floors, deserts where water was scarce and the sun brutal, grasslands exposed to harsh winds. And everywhere, the back-breaking labor of moving earth and stone, pounding it into walls, transporting materials across distances that would challenge modern logistics, let alone ancient ones. It took 9 years of continuous work to complete the first unified Great Wall. 9 years. Think about that. 9 years of waking up every single day knowing you would lift stones, pound earth, climb mountains, and quite possibly die before you ever saw your home again. 9 years during which tens of thousands of workers collapsed from exhaustion, fell from scaffolding, succumbed to disease, or simply gave up and waited for death in the cold northern nights. The emperor never saw most of the wall. He toured sections of it in 212 BC to inspect the progress, but the full length of his creation was too vast for any single person to experience. He died in 210 BC, just 2 years after the wall's completion, during one of his tours of the empire. His dynasty, which he had imagined would last forever, collapsed within 4 years of his death. The Qin Dynasty, for all its achievements and brutality, lasted only 15 years total. But the wall remained. And more than that, the idea of the wall remained. A solution to the eternal problem of how sedentary agricultural societies protect themselves from mobile, pastoral peoples. Every dynasty that came after would have to decide what to do about the northern frontier. Some would maintain and extend the walls. Others would let them fall into ruin, preferring diplomatic or military solutions. But none could ignore the precedent Qin Shi Huang had set. The Han Dynasty, 202 BC to 220 AD, extended the wall westward, protecting the Silk Road trade routes that brought wealth to the empire. The Northern Qi Dynasty, 550 to 574 AD, built or repaired more than 900 miles of wall. The Sui Dynasty, 581 to 618 AD, mobilized over 1 million men for wall construction, a staggering number that reflects both the dynasty's ambition and its eventual overreach. The short-lived Sui dynasty collapsed partly because of the immense human and economic cost of its building projects. And then came the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD, which would create the version of the Great Wall most of us picture today. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the wall's evolution through different dynasties, we need to understand what it meant to be chosen, or forced, to build it. Conscription. The day your life ended. Let me tell you a story. Not about one specific person, no such detailed individual records survive for common workers, but rather a composite drawn from historical accounts, official records of conscription practices, and documented experiences that would have been typical for millions of men across the centuries of wall construction. Imagine you're a farmer. We'll call you Li Wei, a common name representing any of thousands. You're 2 years old, married for 3 years with a 1-year-old son. You live in a village in what's now Hebei province, not far from modern Beijing. Your family has farmed the same land for 3 generations. You grow wheat and millet, keep a few chickens, and supplement your income by making rope during the winter when fields lie dormant. By the standards of your time, you're an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Then one morning, soldiers arrive in your village, They're carrying scrolls with lists of names. They're accompanied by imperial officials who stand in the village square and announce that the emperor requires laborers for a great project to the north, a wall to protect the empire from the barbarian horsemen who raid border settlements. It's your duty as a subject of the empire to serve. It's an honor, they say, though nobody in the village looks honored. They read the names. Your name is on the list. You're given 3 days to prepare for departure. Your wife weeps. Your mother weeps. Your father, who's too old to be conscripted himself, looks at you with an expression you'll remember for the rest of your life. A mix of grief and guilt and helpless rage. He survived his own period of corvée labor decades ago, building a different wall for a different dynasty. He knows what you're facing, and he can't save you from it. The law is clear. Every adult male subject of the empire owes labor to the state. It's called corvée, a system of compulsory, unpaid labor that's been part of Chinese governance for centuries. The emperor can call upon it for public works projects, and the wall is the most public, most vital project imaginable. At least, that's what they tell you. You pack what little you can carry, extra clothes, a blanket, the few coins you've saved. Your wife gives you her best knife, the one with the good handle, even though she'll need it herself. Your son, too young to understand, reaches for your face with his small hands. You hold him and try to memorize the feeling, because somewhere deep down, you suspect you might never hold him again. The 3 days pass too quickly. On the morning of departure, you join maybe 50 other men from your village and the surrounding area at the collection point. Soldiers organize you into groups, assign supervisors, and begin the march north. You're not the only group. All across China, the same scene is playing out in thousands of villages. Millions of men being pulled from their homes and families and lives and sent to build a wall most of them will never see completed. The journey north takes weeks. You walk, always walk, because there's no other way to move masses of people across such distances. Your feet blister and bleed. The soldiers push the pace. They have quotas to meet, schedules to keep. Anyone who falls behind and can't keep up is beaten or abandoned. You see an older man collapse on the road. He's maybe 35, ancient by the standards of conscripted labor. The soldiers glance at him, shake their heads, and keep moving. No one stops to help. Stopping would mean falling behind yourself, and you can't afford that. You meet other groups along the way. Some are civilian conscripts like yourself. Others are prisoners, thieves, debtors, political dissidents, men convicted of crimes both real and fabricated. They march with their heads shaved and iron shackles on their ankles, the marks of their criminal status visible to everyone. According to Qin Dynasty law, these men owe the empire 4 years of labor on the wall. Most won't survive that long. There's a third group too, soldiers, actual military men, trained and equipped, who've been reassigned from fighting the Xiongnu to building fortifications against them. They're better fed than the civilians, better clothed, and they have actual authority in the construction hierarchy. But they're still doing the same back-breaking labor, and they die at almost the same rates. The wall doesn't discriminate. After weeks of marching, you arrive at the construction site. It's even worse than you imagined. The landscape is harsh, all mountains and valleys and exposed ridges where the wind never stops. Temporary camps sprawl across the terrain, housing thousands of workers. The smell hits you first: unwashed bodies, human waste, death. The camps are squalid, overcrowded, and chaotic. Men sleep on the bare ground or in crude shelters made of brush and scraps. There are no proper sanitation facilities. Disease spreads like fire. You're assigned to a work crew of about 20 men, overseen by a soldier who makes it clear from the start that your survival is less important than meeting the day's quota. He doesn't care about your name. You're just another body, another unit of labor to be extracted and expended. If you die, they'll replace you with another conscript from another village. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands, millions of workers over the centuries of wall construction. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. During Emperor Qin Shi Huang's reign, roughly 20% of China's total population was involved in building the wall. Think about that. Imagine if tomorrow, 1 in 5 people in your country were forcibly conscripted for a single construction project. The social disruption would be catastrophic. And it was. Ancient records document the human cost beyond the deaths. During the Wei Jin and Southern Northern dynasties, around 265 to 589 AD, the demand for labor was so extreme that even children were conscripted. Women feared giving birth to sons because boys would be taken for wall duty. Widowers refused to remarry because new wives might bear son. Men were so scarce in some regions that no one was left to farm the fields, leading to crop failures and famine. The Sui dynasty, which mobilized over 1 million workers for wall construction, also resorted to conscripting widows, women whose husbands had already died building the wall, because so many men had been killed that they literally ran out of male laborers. These women were sent to the northern frontier to work alongside men, performing the same brutal tasks, suffering the same conditions. Many never returned. The northern Qin Dynasty, which built or repaired about 900 miles of wall, required 1.8 million laborers for that single project. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire population of modern-day Guinea-Bissau or Bahrain being forced to work on a single construction project simultaneously. The system was designed to be efficient in the most ruthless sense of the word. Officials in each province were given quotas, numbers of workers to provide based on population. They compiled lists from local registries, prioritizing men without families or connections who wouldn't be missed as much. But when quotas weren't met through targeted selection, they simply took anyone they could find. If you were male, able-bodied, and in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could be conscripted on the spot. Some men tried to escape before the soldiers arrived. They fled to the mountains or hid in other villages, hoping to wait out the conscription cycle. But the penalties for draft evasion were severe. If you were caught, your entire family could be punished. Fines, confiscation of property, sometimes execution. The system was designed to make resistance not just difficult, but unthinkable for anyone who cared about the people they'd leave behind. Others mutilated themselves, cutting off fingers or toes, blinding themselves, breaking their own bones, anything to make themselves unfit for labor. Ancient records document this practice, describing men who would rather maim themselves than face the wall. That tells you something about how terrible the alternative must have been. For those who were criminals, the choice was different, but no less grim. You could serve your sentence in a local prison, enduring whatever punishments were prescribed by law, or you could volunteer for wall duty with the promise that 4 years of labor would clear your record. Many chose the wall, not realizing that 4 years on the frontier was essentially a delayed death sentence with extra steps. Soldiers had no choice at all. They went where they were ordered, and for much of the wall's construction history, that meant reassignment from active military campaigns to building projects. These were trained fighters, men who'd proven themselves in battle, now reduced to hauling stones and packing earth. Some resented it bitterly. Others accepted it as just another form of service to the emperor. Either way, they worked and they died, at rates that would shock modern military commanders. As you stand in that camp for the first time, looking at thousands of exhausted, desperate men, you begin to understand the fundamental truth of your situation. You're not here to build a monument. You're here to be used up and discarded in the service of imperial ambition. The wall will stand for centuries. You'll be lucky to survive a year. Welcome to the Great Wall of China. Your new life, such as it is, has begun. The brutal reality. Dawn to death. The horn sounds while it's still dark. Not a gentle wake-up call, but a harsh blare designed to jolt you from whatever fitful sleep you manage to achieve on the cold ground. Around you, men groan and stir. Some don't move at all. They died during the night from exhaustion, disease, or exposure, and their bodies will be dragged away later to be buried near the wall or within it. You've been here 3 weeks now. Your hands, which were once soft from farming, are now masses of calluses, cuts, and broken blisters. Your back aches constantly from lifting stones and hauling earth. You've lost weight. Everyone loses weight on wall duty, and the gnawing hunger in your stomach never completely goes away. But you're alive, and after 3 weeks, that's something. You stumble to your feet, joints protesting. The morning routine is the same every day. No breakfast yet. That comes later, if you're lucky. First, you line up with your work crew for the morning count. The overseers need to know who died overnight and who's too sick to work. If you're sick but can still stand, you're working. Only the truly incapacitated, men who literally cannot walk, are excused, and they're left in the camp with no guarantee they'll survive the day without food or care. The sun is starting to rise now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink that would be beautiful if you had any energy left to appreciate beauty. But you don't. You're focused on getting through the day without dying. That's the entirety of your ambition now. Your work crew is assigned to stone transport today. That means hiking up the mountainside to where other crews are quarrying rock, loading the stones onto carrying frames, and hauling them back down to the construction site. A single stone might weigh anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds. You'll carry it on your back using a wooden frame, climbing steep paths, navigating loose scree, trying not to slip and fall, because a fall with that much weight could break bones or snap your spine. The work is mind-numbing in its repetition. Load the stone, climb down the mountain. Deposit the stone, climb back up. Load another stone. Repeat, repeat, repeat. You do this dozens of times per day, hundreds of times per week. Your body moves mechanically, too exhausted to think about anything except the next step, the next breath. Around you, other crews are doing different tasks, but equally brutal ones. Some are quarrying stone, using hammers and chisels to break rock from the mountain face. These men are especially vulnerable to injury. Flying stone chips blind workers or cut faces. Cave-ins crush men against rock walls. Tools break and maim the hands holding them. Every day in the quarry is a gamble with death and disfigurement. Other crews are building the wall itself. They work with rammed earth, pounding soil between wooden frames until it compacts into solid barriers. In some sections, workers mix earth with lime, sand, and small stones to create stronger composite materials. The pounding is done with heavy mallets, hour after hour, beating the earth into submission. Your arms feel like they're on fire after an hour. After 4 hours, you can barely lift the mallet. After 8 hours, you're working on pure survival instinct, your body moving while your mind floats somewhere else. There's a rhythm to it, almost meditative if you can detach yourself from the pain. The thud of mallets against earth, the grunts of workers, the shouts of overseers, the wind whistling through the mountain passes, the occasional scream when someone falls or drops a stone on their foot or collapses from heat exhaustion. The sun climbs higher, the temperature rises. In summer, the heat is crushing. Temperatures regularly exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit in many sections. You sweat through your thin clothes within an hour, and the sweat attracts flies and other insects. Dehydration is a constant threat. Water is rationed, carried up from distant streams or wells by dedicated water crews, and there's never enough. You drink your allotted portion and wish desperately for more, but wishing doesn't create water in a semi-arid climate. In winter, the suffering is different, but no less severe. Temperatures plunge below freezing. The wind is like knives against exposed skin. Your clothes, thin cotton garments that were barely adequate in summer, are pathetically inadequate against the cold. Men develop frostbite. Fingers and toes turn black and fall off. Some workers freeze to death in their sleep. Others become so cold they can't coordinate their movements and fall from scaffolding or walkways, plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. Spring and autumn offer brief reprieves when the temperature is tolerable, but they bring their own challenges. Spring rains turn work sites into muddy quagmires where footing is treacherous and stones slip from wet hands. Autumn brings storms that can flood valleys and destroy months of work in a single night. The wall doesn't take breaks for bad weather. If you can stand, you work. Midday brings the first meal, your only meal of the day if you're a civilian conscript. A bowl of gruel made from millet, sorghum, or barley, depending on what the supply trains have brought. It's thin, barely enough to keep you alive, let alone maintain the muscle mass and energy needed for heavy labor. Soldiers get slightly better rations, sometimes a bit of dried fish or salted meat, but even they're operating at a caloric deficit. The gruel is served from large pots at the camp's edge. You wait in line, bowl in hand, while workers ladle out portions. There's no talking, no socializing. Everyone is too tired, too focused on eating what little they have before the overseers drive them back to work. You eat standing up, shoveling the gruel into your mouth, barely tasting it. It's fuel, nothing more. Some workers supplement their rations by foraging, catching rodents, finding edible plants, trading what little they have with supply caravans. But foraging takes time and energy you don't really have, and getting caught away from your workstation can result in beatings. The risk-reward calculation rarely works out favorably. The afternoon is the hardest part of the day. Your body is exhausted, your energy depleted, but there are still hours of work ahead. This is when accidents happen most frequently. Men become careless from fatigue. They misjudge distances, lose their grip on stones, stumble on uneven ground. You see a man in another crew drop a stone that crushes his foot. He screams, a sound that cuts through everything else, and two other workers drag him away. He won't be working tomorrow. Whether he'll be alive tomorrow is an open question. The overseers patrol constantly, watching for anyone who's slowing down or stopping to rest. If they catch you resting without permission, they'll beat you with bamboo canes. Hard enough to hurt, but usually not hard enough to render you unable to work. You're valuable as a laborer, but you're not so valuable that they can't afford to punish you for laziness or insubordination. There's a dark calculus at work. The Empire has invested resources in getting you here, but not so much that they can't replace you. You're slightly more valuable alive and working than dead, but only slightly. If the cost of keeping you alive exceeds your labor output, they'll let you die and conscript someone else. It's economics reduced to its most brutal form. You see men break under the psychological strain. Some simply give up. They sit down on the rocks and refuse to move, accepting whatever punishment comes. Most are beaten and dragged back to their posts. A few are beaten and left where they fall, examples for the others. You learn quickly not to look too closely at the broken men. Looking means empathizing, and empathy is a luxury you can't afford. You need to save every bit of emotional energy for your own survival. The sun begins to set. Finally, mercifully, the evening horn sounds. Work stops. Based on descriptions in historical records and surviving administrative documents about labor camp routines, we can reconstruct the likely evening sequence. Workers would trudge back to camp, exhausted beyond description. Contemporary accounts describe workers whose legs trembled like reeds and whose hands were torn as if by tigers' claws. Poetic descriptions that suggest both the physical toll and the cultural memory of these conditions. At the camp, there might be another small meal. More gruel, perhaps with a few scraps of vegetables if the supply lines have been kind. But administrative records noting supply shortages suggest there were often days when evening rations simply didn't arrive. Workers would collapse onto the ground in areas designated for their crews. Surviving poems and folk songs from various dynasties describe nighttime camp scenes, men coughing from respiratory ailments, others speaking to ghosts of ancestors, likely prayers, some singing mournful songs about home, cultural practices documented across Chinese history as ways of maintaining morale and spiritual connection during hardship. The death rate during intensive construction periods reached approximately 10%, according to historical records from the Qin Dynasty, as documented in later Han Dynasty chronicles that criticized Qin policies. This means, in a work crew of 100 men, 10 would die within a year from disease, accidents, exhaustion, or exposure. In a camp of 10,000 workers, that's 1,000 deaths per year. Over the 9 years of initial Qin Dynasty construction, with roughly 800,000 workers involved, historical sources cite approximately 130,000 deaths, figures that align with the 10% mortality estimate and suggest the rate may have been consistent across different regions and construction sites. But these are just numbers recorded in imperial archives. The lived reality, which we can infer from later literary references and folklore, is that every single day, people you knew, men you'd worked beside, shared meager rations with, told stories with during brief evening respites, simply stopped existing. Contemporary poems describe workers becoming accustomed to death as farmers become accustomed to rain, a chilling metaphor that suggests both the frequency of death and the psychological numbing required to continue functioning. Bodies were dealt with in the most ex-oriented way possible, based on both administrative logic and archaeological evidence. Historical records make no mention of elaborate funeral procedures or transportation of corpses back to home villages. Such transportation would have been expensive and time-consuming. Archaeological excavations at various wall sites have found remains buried in shallow graves near construction areas, consistent with the practice of quick local interment. While the famous legend suggests bodies were built directly into the wall structure, archaeological investigations have not confirmed this. The evidence points instead to burial in the immediate vicinity of where workers died, which was pragmatic from a labor management perspective, but no less grim. Night falls completely. The temperature drops. You huddle in your threadbare blanket, trying to stay warm. Tomorrow will be the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that. The only variations are the specific ways men die and whether you'll be one of them. You think about your wife, your son, your parents. You wonder if they're alive, if they're managing without you, if your son will remember your face. The ache of that loss is almost worse than the physical pain. But you push it down, deep down, because dwelling on what you've lost will break you, and you can't afford to break. Not yet. The stars come out, bright in the unpolluted sky. They're the same stars you saw from your village, but they look different from here. Colder, more distant, indifferent to human suffering. You close your eyes and pray for sleep, knowing that in just a few hours, the horn will sound again, and this entire brutal cycle will repeat. This is what it meant to build the Great Wall of China. Day after day after day, until either the wall was complete or you were dead. For most workers, death came first. Survival, hunger, disease, and the will to live. The first thing you learn on the Great Wall is that hunger is a constant companion. Not the kind of hunger where you skip breakfast and your stomach grumbles by lunch. The deep, gnawing, consuming hunger that makes your ribs show through your skin and turns your thoughts foggy and slow. The kind that makes you weak and dizzy and desperate enough to eat things you never imagined eating. Your daily ration, when it comes, is barely enough to sustain minimal human function. The imperial supply system provides grains, primarily millet, sorghum, and barley, that are prepared into thin gruel or baked into hard, barely edible cakes. Historical records from various periods document ration sizes, though they vary by dynasty and region. Based on what we know about grain distributions to corvée laborers and the descriptions in surviving administrative documents, a worker might receive the equivalent of a few handfuls of grain per day, prepared in the simplest possible way to stretch supplies as far as possible. Here's the mathematics of starvation. A man performing heavy physical labor in extreme conditions burns somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day. Your ration, based on the quantities described in historical sources and modern nutritional analysis of ancient grains, would provide maybe 1,200 to 1,500 calories if you're lucky, less than a third of what your body actually needs. This isn't just hunger. This is a death sentence written in subtraction. Your body begins consuming itself to make up the difference. First, it burns through the minimal fat reserves you don't really have after weeks on insufficient rations. Then, and this is where it becomes genuinely horrifying, your body starts breaking down muscle tissue for energy. You're literally eating yourself from the inside, growing progressively weaker day by day, until eventually your muscles can no longer perform the labor demanded of them. Your heart weakens, your organs begin to fail, and you collapse. Death from what we now call starvation-related complications. The meals are monotonous beyond description. Millet gruel for breakfast, if there's breakfast. Millet gruel at midday. Maybe some barley cake in the evening if the supply caravans have arrived on time and the officers haven't skimmed too much for themselves. Occasionally, very occasionally, there might be preserved vegetables. Pickled cabbage, salted radish, fermented turnips. Small bits of flavor and nutrition that seem like incredible luxuries after weeks of bland grain products. Soldiers receive slightly better rations. They might get dried or salted meat a few times per week, small portions of pork or mutton that have been preserved for transport. They might get fish if the wall section is near a river or lake. But even soldier rations are insufficient for the work demanded, and most soldiers lose weight and strength over the months of wall construction. Criminals and civilian conscripts receive the bare minimum, and sometimes less than that. When supply lines are disrupted by weather or enemy action or simple logistical failure, rations are cut first for the lowest status workers. You might go days with nothing but water and whatever you can forage. Men become skeletal. You can count every bone in their bodies. Their eyes sink deep into their skulls. They move like ghosts, barely present, clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Malnutrition brings other problems beyond hunger. Your teeth become loose from scurvy, lack of vitamin C from the grain-heavy diet with almost no fresh fruits or vegetables. Your gums bleed. Your skin develops sores that won't heal. You bruise easily, and the bruises turn spectacular colors but refuse to fade. Your hair begins to fall out. Your vision weakens in the darkness of night. These are the classic signs of vitamin deficiencies, and they affect nearly every worker to some degree. Some men try to supplement their rations through foraging. In areas where the wall passed through valleys or near streams, you might find wild plants, herbs, grasses, roots that are technically edible. You learn quickly which plants can be eaten and which will make you sick or kill you. You catch small animals if you're lucky, rats, mice, lizards, birds. You eat them raw or barely cooked. Because fuel for fires is scarce and cooking takes time you often don't have. Local villagers, when there are villages near construction sites, sometimes trade with workers despite imperial prohibitions against it. A woman might sell a few eggs or a bit of preserved meat in exchange for whatever tiny amounts of currency or trade goods a worker has managed to keep. These transactions happen quietly, in shadows, because both parties could be punished if caught. But hunger drives both sides, the workers desperate for food, the villagers desperate for any economic opportunity in regions that have been devastated by having huge labor camps imposed upon them. The water situation is equally precarious. Water is heavy and difficult to transport in quantity, especially in mountainous terrain. Dedicated crews haul water from streams, wells, or springs, sometimes miles away, bringing it to work sites in jars and barrels. But the demand always exceeds supply. In summer, when men are sweating constantly and losing water through respiration and exertion, the rations are woefully inadequate. You're always thirsty, throat perpetually dry, lips cracked and bleeding. The water that is available is often contaminated. Ancient China had no concept of germ theory or water purification. Water sources near camps become polluted with human waste, refuse, and the decay of bodies that haven't been buried far enough away. Drinking this water spreads dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and other waterborne diseases that kill thousands of workers. Disease is perhaps the single greatest killer on the wall, more deadly even than accidents or exposure. When you pack thousands of men into camps with no sanitation systems, no waste management, no medical care, disease spreads like wildfire. Dysentery is ubiquitous. The symptoms are devastating. Severe diarrhea, bloody stools, dehydration, weakness. Men with dysentery literally waste away, unable to absorb nutrients from the meager food they eat, evacuating fluids their bodies desperately need. Within days or weeks, they're dead. Typhoid is another major killer. It comes from contaminated water or food and spreads easily in crowded conditions. The symptoms start subtle: fever, headache, fatigue, but progress to high fever, abdominal pain, and a peculiar rash. Without treatment, and there is no effective treatment in ancient China, the mortality rate is somewhere between 10 and 20%. Those who survive are often weakened for months afterward, unable to perform hard labor. Respiratory diseases flourish in the cold, damp, overcrowded conditions. Pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, all spread easily when men are packed together in shelters with poor ventilation, breathing each other's air, coughing and spitting and contaminating shared living spaces. Men who start with a simple cold often progress to serious respiratory illness within days. They cough blood, struggle to breathe, and drown slowly in their own fluids. You learn to recognize the sound of death-rattle breathing, and you learn to avoid men making that sound because they'll be dead soon and their illness might be contagious. Parasitic infections are everywhere. Worms enter your body through contaminated water or food, or through cuts and abrasions in your skin from walking barefoot or wearing worn-out shoes. They establish themselves in your intestines and reproduce, consuming nutrients your body desperately needs, causing pain and bloating and diarrhea. Some parasites cause you to void lengths of worm when you defecate, a horrifying experience that somehow becomes routine after a while. Injuries are common and often fatal because there's virtually no medical care. A simple cut on your hand from handling rough stone can become infected. Without antibiotics, which won't be invented for more than 2,000 years, infections progress to blood poisoning. Your hand swells, turns red, then black as the tissue dies. The infection spreads up your arm. You develop fever, delirium, and eventually organ failure. You die, and your body joins the countless others buried near the wall. Broken bones are a death sentence unless you're extremely lucky. A worker who breaks a leg falling from scaffolding might be left where he falls if the break is bad enough that he can't walk. Even if he's brought back to camp, there's no skilled medical attention, no way to properly set the bone, no possibility of the long rest period needed for healing. The best-case scenario is that the bone heals badly and you're crippled for life. The worst case, far more common, is that the injury becomes infected and you die screaming from gangrene. There are no doctors, or at least none with any real training or resources. Some work crews might have a man with basic medical knowledge, someone who knows how to bind wounds or set simple fractures, but he has no supplies, no tools, and no time. Medical care consists of washing wounds with contaminated water, binding them with dirty cloth, and hoping for the best. It rarely works. Pain is constant and universal. Your back aches from lifting and carrying. Your shoulders are raw from carrying frame straps. Your hands are a mess of blisters, calluses, and cuts. Your feet are covered in sores from walking miles every day in inadequate footwear. Your joints ache, especially in cold weather when arthritis sets in prematurely from the constant strain and poor nutrition. You're in your 20s or 30s, but your body feels ancient. Sleep offers only temporary relief. The sleeping arrangements are primitive at best. In early construction periods, men simply slept on the ground in the open or under makeshift shelters of brush and cloth. Later, some camps developed more permanent structures, low buildings of rammed earth or wood, barrack style, where men crowded together on platforms or the dirt floor. But these are always overcrowded, always cold in winter and stifling in summer, always infested with lice and fleas and bedbugs. You're woken constantly by the coughing of sick men, by the moans of the injured, by your own body's demands to urinate or defecate. Proper latrines are rare. Most camps have simple pit toilets, holes in the ground where men squat to relieve themselves. These fill quickly and overflow, creating unsanitary conditions that breed disease and attract flies and other insects. The smell is overwhelming, inescapable. Psychological stress compounds everything else. You're isolated from everything you know and love. You have no idea when, or if, you'll ever go home. Letters are impossible. Even if you could write, and most workers are illiterate, there's no postal system for common laborers. Communication with your family exists only in your memories and imagination. Over time, those memories fade and distort. You start forgetting your wife's face, your son's voice. The loss of these mental anchors is its own kind of death. Some men maintain hope. They tell stories about home, make plans for what they'll do when they're finally released, encourage each other to hang on just a little longer. Others sink into despair. They stop caring about anything, stop trying to stay clean or healthy, simply go through the motions until death claims them. You see it in their eyes, a hollowness, an absence of the spark that makes someone fully human. Suicide is not uncommon. A man might step off a cliff during a stone-carrying trip, or walk away from camp into the wilderness and simply not return, or lie down one night and refuse to wake up the next morning. The overseers don't really care. One fewer mouth to feed, one fewer body taking up space. They note the death in their records and move on. And yet somehow, some men survive. Not most. The mortality rate ensures that most don't, but some. The survivors are the lucky ones in terms of sheer chance, but they're also the unlucky ones because they live with the memories of what they endured and what they witnessed. They return to their villages, if their villages still exist, as broken men, physically scarred and psychologically traumatized, carrying stories that are almost too horrible to believe. You wonder constantly whether you'll be a survivor or a statistic. Every morning when you wake up and find yourself still breathing, you're surprised. Every evening when you lie down, you wonder if this is the night you won't wake from. It's a strange way to live, in this constant negotiation with death, but it becomes your reality. You've been on the wall for 4 months now. You've lost probably 30 pounds from a frame that wasn't heavy to begin with. Your clothes hang loose on your skeletal body. You have a persistent cough that won't go away, probably bronchitis, possibly something worse. 2 of your teeth have fallen out. You have dysentery again, your 3rd bout, and you've learned to just work through the cramping and diarrhea because there's no other choice. But you're alive. Against all odds, through some combination of luck and stubbornness, and the random nature of who gets sick and who doesn't, you're still alive. You've watched men stronger than you die, and men weaker than you survive. You've learned that survival has very little to do with merit or strength or virtue. It's mostly just chance, dice thrown by insufferent gods. You've learned to exist in a kind of diminished state, where your entire world has shrunk to the most basic needs: food, water, warmth, the absence of pain. Everything else, hope, joy, love, meaning, has been burned away by the unrelenting grind of simple survival. You're not really living. You're just not dying, which is a very different thing. And the wall continues growing, stone by stone, mile by mile, built on the bodies and suffering of men like you, built on hunger and disease and despair, built on the calculation that human life is cheap and human suffering is acceptable if it serves the empire's needs. This is survival on the Great Wall of China. Not triumph, not heroism, just the grim mathematics of attrition and the small victory of lasting one more day. Climate and geography, where Earth becomes an enemy. The Great Wall of China wasn't built in a single place or a single type of terrain. It stretched across thousands of miles of some of the most challenging geography on the planet, crossing deserts and mountains and grasslands and river valleys, each presenting its own unique forms of suffering for the workers forced to build there. In the west, the wall passed through the Gobi Desert and the arid regions of Gansu province. If you were sent to these sections, you faced a landscape that seemed designed to kill humans. The desert is unforgiving in its simplicity. Vast expanses of sand and rock and nothing, extending to the horizon in every direction. Water is scarce, sometimes non-existent. What little vegetation grows consists of hardy shrubs and grasses that can survive on minimal moisture. The temperature extremes in the desert are brutal. During summer days, surface temperatures can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause second-degree burns if you fall on exposed rock. Air temperature regularly hits 110 to 120 degrees. There's no shade, no trees, no natural shelter, just the relentless sun beating down from a cloudless sky. The sand and rocks radiate heat, turning the entire landscape into an oven that cooks you from all directions simultaneously. Here's something that illustrates the lethal nature of these conditions. Modern military research on heat casualties shows that at these temperatures, with the physical exertion levels required for construction work, an unacclimated person can die of heat stroke in as little as 30 to 60 minutes. Even acclimated workers, which these men would become if they survived their first weeks, face severe risk. Historical records don't give us precise heat casualty figures. Ancient chroniclers didn't categorize deaths by specific cause, but they do describe work stopping during the demon hours of midday summer, suggesting supervisors recognized that pushing work during peak heat killed workers faster than the supply chains could replace them. At night, the desert becomes a different kind of hell. The lack of cloud cover means heat radiates away quickly, and temperatures can plunge by 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A day that saw temperatures over 100 might have a night that drops to 40 or 50 degrees. Your clothes, soaked with sweat during the day, become cold and clammy against your skin. You shiver uncontrollably, unable to get warm, because there's little fuel for fires in the desert, and what fuel exists is needed for cooking the meager rations or for construction purposes like heating stones to create stress fractures for quarrying. Dust storms are another desert hazard. They come suddenly, driven by high winds, turning the air into an abrasive brown soup that gets into everything. You breathe dust, eat dust, taste nothing but grit for days afterward. The storms can be strong enough to knock men down, to tear away shelters, to blind workers who are caught in the open. Ancient records describe visibility dropping to zero, workers becoming lost and wandering until they collapse and die just meters from their camps. Building in the desert required adapting techniques to the available materials. There were no forests for timber, no nearby quarries for stone. Workers used what they had: sand, gravel, and reeds or willow branches harvested from rare oases. The construction technique involved layering sand between bundles of reeds, packing it down, then adding another layer. It was slow, painstaking work, and the resulting walls, while surprisingly durable, were nothing like the stone and brick fortifications in other regions. Archaeological studies of Han Dynasty wall sections in the desert have found that these fascina walls, bundles of reeds and branches, mixed with sand, created surprisingly strong structures, some of which still stand more than 2,000 years later at heights of nearly 10 feet. The reeds, preserved by the dry climate, reveal something interesting. They were common reeds that grow in wetlands, which means workers had to transport these bundles from distant oases, carrying them across miles of desert to construction sites. Just imagine the labor involved: harvesting reeds at an oasis, binding them into bundles, then hauling them on your back or on carts across burning sand to where they were needed. In the mountains, which comprise much of the wall's most famous sections, the challenges were completely different. Mountain construction meant working on steep slopes where a single misstep could send you tumbling hundreds of feet down rocky slopes. The terrain was jagged, unstable, and constantly threatening. Workers quarried stone from the mountainsides themselves, using basic tools to break rock, then hauled these enormous blocks up steep inclines to construction sites perched on ridgelines. The elevation brought its own problems. At higher altitudes, the air is thinner, containing less oxygen. Workers who were already weakened by malnutrition and disease found themselves gasping for breath, unable to work as efficiently as they could at sea level. Altitude sickness was common, but not recognized as a medical condition. Workers just knew they felt dizzy and nauseous and weak when working high on the mountains, without understanding why. Mountain weather is notoriously unpredictable and severe. Storms could arrive without warning, bringing lightning strikes that killed exposed workers, or winds strong enough to blow men off scaffolding. Rain turned already treacherous paths into mudslides. Workers slipped and fell, or were buried by rock slides triggered by the construction itself. The casualty rate in mountainous sections was particularly high, and bodies often couldn't be recovered from ravines and crevasses, left where they fell to be consumed by scavengers or the elements. Snow and ice made winter construction in the mountains nearly impossible. Yet work continued anyway, driven by imperial demands and overseer quotas. Workers labored in sub-freezing temperatures, their hands going numb, unable to feel the tools they held. Frostbite was epidemic. Toes and fingers blackened and had to be amputated. Crude amputations performed by other workers with no medical training, using whatever sharp tools were available, often leading to infection and death. The grasslands and plains of Inner Mongolia presented yet another set of challenges. These regions were exposed to harsh continental winds that blew constantly, creating wind chill that made already cold temperatures feel even colder. There was little natural shelter from the wind. Dust and sand blown by these winds, abraded exposed skin, got into eyes and lungs, made every outdoor task more difficult. The grasslands were also where the wall's military function was most relevant. These were the regions where Xiongnu raiders were most likely to attack. Workers in these sections faced not just the usual hazards of construction, but also the possibility of enemy raids that could kill or capture them. Some workers were killed in Xiongnu attacks. Others were carried off as prisoners and never seen again. Seasonal variations affected all regions, but manifested differently in each. Spring brought sandstorms in the desert, floods in river valleys, and mudslides in the mountains. Summer brought brutal heat in the lowlands and slightly more moderate temperatures in the high mountains. Autumn offered a brief window of relatively tolerable conditions before winter arrived. And winter was deadly everywhere, in every type of terrain. Historical records from the Ming Dynasty describe the challenges of different geographical sections. The western route passed through the Loess Plateau, a region of fine, yellowish sediment that erodes easily. Building on Loess required special techniques because the soil structure was unstable. Walls built of Loess had to be wider at the base, with careful drainage to prevent water erosion. Workers dealt with constant dust, loose soil that slid unexpectedly, and the need to constantly repair sections damaged by erosion. The eastern route, closer to Beijing, passed through more moderate terrain, but still included significant mountains and river crossings. Some sections had to be built across river valleys, requiring the construction of artificial embankments and bridges to carry the wall continuously. These were engineering challenges that required skilled laborers, not the unskilled conscripts who formed the bulk of the workforce, but trained masons and engineers who understood principles of load-bearing and structural integrity. Climate studies using materials from the wall itself have revealed patterns that fundamentally change our understanding of ancient construction conditions. Scientists have analyzed ancient reeds preserved in western sections of the Han Dynasty wall, built roughly 2,000 years ago, using sophisticated isotope analysis to reconstruct historical climate conditions. What they've found is genuinely surprising. The regions where the wall was built weren't always as arid as they are today. 2,000 years ago, when the Han Dynasty extended the wall westward, northwestern China supported lakes and oases that have since disappeared. Isotope analysis of carbon and nitrogen in the preserved reeds, compared with modern samples, reveals that significant hydrological changes occurred primarily after the Song dynasty, around 1000 AD, meaning workers in ancient times had somewhat better access to water and forage than the barren landscape of today might suggest. But here's the twist that makes this discovery both fascinating and tragic. Somewhat better is relative. Even with more water sources than exist today, the region was still harsh desert. Workers still died of dehydration at alarming rates according to historical records. The improved conditions we can detect scientifically, conditions that sound better than what modern desert travelers face, were still lethal. That tells you just how extreme the baseline suffering was. If having more water than today's desert still resulted in mass death from thirst, imagine how thin the margin of survival was. The climate has continued to affect the wall in modern times. Climate change has increased extreme weather events in northern China, more frequent heavy rains, more intense flooding. Nearly 90% of the wall's remaining sections are now at risk of collapse, deterioration, or complete disappearance due to natural erosion. The same forces that made building the wall so difficult continue to attack it centuries later. For workers on the wall, geography and climate weren't abstract concepts. They were daily, immediate threats to survival. The mountain could kill you with a rockfall. The desert could kill you with thirst. The grasslands could kill you with cold. Every type of terrain found ways to make human life miserable and disposable. You had no choice in where you were assigned. You might come from a rice-growing village in the south, accustomed to warm, humid conditions and regular rainfall, only to be sent to the freezing mountains or burning deserts of the north, where everything was alien and hostile. Or you might come from a northern village and think you understood the terrain, only to discover that the specific mountain pass or desert valley where you're working has its own microclimate and hazards you never encountered before. The wall's route was chosen for strategic and defensive reasons, not for the convenience or safety of the workers. It followed the most defensible terrain, which often meant the most difficult terrain. It climbed ridiculous slopes because those slopes offered military advantages. It crossed deserts because the deserts marked the frontier between settled and nomadic territories. And if that meant workers died in greater numbers, well, workers were expendable. The wall was what mattered. After months on the wall, you developed an intimate relationship with the landscape, though not a friendly one. You learned to read the weather, to recognize the signs of an approaching storm, to find the most sheltered spots for your brief rest periods. You learned which streams were least likely to make you sick, which plants could supplement your meager rations, where the wind was strongest and had to be avoided. But knowing the landscape didn't mean mastering it. Nature remained fundamentally indifferent to your survival. The mountain didn't care if you fell. The desert didn't care if you died of thirst. The winter wind didn't care if you froze. You were a temporary intruder in spaces that had existed for millions of years and would exist millions of years after your bones had turned to dust. This geographical and climatic reality, perhaps more than any other single factor, explains why the Great Wall's human cost was so staggering. It wasn't just that the work was hard or the rations inadequate or the overseers brutal. It was that the work was hard in landscapes that were actively hostile to human life, where every day brought new ways for the environment to kill you, where simply staying alive required constant vigilance and luck. The wall stands today as a testament to human engineering, but it also stands as a testament to human suffering in conditions that tested the absolute limits of what flesh and blood can endure. Most who worked on it didn't endure. They died, and the earth that defeated them in life became their final resting place. Construction methods, the evolution of a monument. The Great Wall, we see in photographs today, massive grey brick fortifications snaking along mountain ridges, bears little resemblance to the Qin, earliest versions built more than 2,000 years ago. The wall evolved dramatically over its long construction history, with each dynasty bringing new materials, new techniques, and new approaches to the fundamental problem of building an enormous defensive structure across impossibly varied terrain. The earliest walls, built during the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC, by various competing kingdoms, used rammed earth construction. This technique, called hangtu in Chinese, had been used in China for centuries for various building projects. It was simple in concept, but brutally difficult in execution. Workers would dig trenches to create foundations, then erect temporary wooden frames, essentially large boxes open at the top. They would fill these frames with loose earth, mixed sometimes with gravel or stones, then pound it repeatedly with heavy wooden or stone mallets until it compressed into a solid, stable mass. The pounding was the crucial step. Imagine spending hours raising and dropping a 20-pound mallet onto earth, feeling the jarring impact in your arms and shoulders, hearing the thud echo off the surrounding landscape. You pound until the earth stops compressing, until it becomes hard enough to stand on, until it can support the weight of the next layer. Then you add another layer of earth and repeat the process. and repeat, and repeat. A single section of rammed earth wall might require dozens of workers pounding for days to create just a few feet of height. The frames would be removed, repositioned higher, and the process would continue until the wall reached its desired height, typically 15 to 30 feet for defensive walls. The base would be wider than the top, creating a trapezoidal cross-section that provided stability. Rammed earth walls were surprisingly durable. When properly constructed, they could withstand significant abuse from weather and even primitive weapons. But they had weaknesses. Heavy rains could erode them, especially if drainage wasn't properly managed. They required constant maintenance, and they were labor-intensive to an almost absurd degree. Thousands of workers pounding earth to create walls that stretched for hundreds of miles. When Qin Shi Huang unified China and began connecting the various state walls into a continuous barrier, his workers used primarily rammed earth techniques because that's what they knew. But they had to adapt these techniques to different regional conditions. In some areas, they added lime or small stones to the earth mixture, creating a more durable composite material. In others, they used whatever local materials were available. In the desert, layers of sand and reeds. In mountains, more stone content in the earth mixture. The Qin Wall also incorporated natural terrain features wherever possible. Rather than building freestanding walls continuously, engineers would take advantage of mountain ridges, river gorges, and other natural barriers that made enemy passage difficult. In these sections, the wall might be lower or even discontinuous, with natural obstacles filling the gaps. This was practical engineering. Why build what nature had already provided? But it also reflected the reality that even with 1 million workers, resources were limited. The Han Dynasty, 202 BC to 220 AD, extended the wall westward into desert regions, developing new techniques suitable for arid environments. They perfected the use of fascines, bundles of reeds, willow branches, and tamarisk twigs, mixed with layers of sand and gravel. The fascines provided tensile strength and helped bind the sand together. Workers would lay down a layer of fascines, cover it with sand, pack it down, then repeat. The result was a composite structure that worked remarkably well in desert conditions. Archaeological analysis of Han walls in Gansu and Xinjiang has revealed sophisticated construction. The fascines were carefully bundled, all aligned in the same direction for maximum strength. The layers alternated between fascines and sand, creating a laminated structure. Some sections included hardwood branches mixed with the reeds for added strength. These walls have survived for over 2,000 years in the desert, preserved by the dry climate, still standing at heights up to 10 feet. The logistics of Han-era desert construction were staggering. Workers had to harvest reeds from oases, wetland areas that could be tens or hundreds of miles from construction sites. They bundled the reeds, loaded them onto carts or animals, and transported them across the desert. At the same time, other crews were collecting sand and gravel, and yet others were building the actual wall. The coordination required was impressive, especially considering the distances involved and the primitive communication and transportation technologies available. Stone walls appeared in mountainous regions where stone was the most readily available material. Building with stone required different skills in itself than rammed earth construction. Workers needed to quarry stone, breaking rock from mountainsides using hammers, chisels, wedges, and often fire heating the rock face with fires, then rapidly cooling it with water to create stress cracks that made breaking easier. The quarried stones then had to be rough-shaped to fit together, hauled to construction sites, and carefully stacked. Early stone walls were often dry-stacked, built without mortar, relying purely on the weight and friction of stones fit carefully together. This required skill to select and place stones so they interlocked properly and created a stable structure. Later, mortar was introduced to bind stones together more securely. Early mortars used lime mixed with water and sometimes sand. These mortars weren't as strong as modern cement, but they added significant stability to stone walls and prevented vegetation from growing in cracks between stones. For centuries, this patchwork of construction techniques, rammed earth, fascines and sand, stone, and various combinations characterized the Great Wall. Different sections looked completely different from each other because they were built with different materials, using different techniques at different times. The wall wasn't really a single unified structure, but rather a collection of fortifications connected by geography and strategic purpose. Then came the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD, which revolutionized wall construction and created the version we mostly see today. The Ming had several advantages over earlier dynasties. They had more advanced ceramic technology, which meant they could produce bricks in quantity. They had better mortar, including the famous sticky rice mortar that incorporated rice paste as a binding agent. And they had learned from centuries of earlier wall-building efforts what worked and what didn't. Bricks were the game changer. A brick is a standardized building unit, uniform in size and shape, easy to transport, relatively speaking, and simple to work with compared to irregular stones or hand-pounded earth. The Ming established brick kilns near major construction sites, turning these areas into industrial production centers. Workers would mine clay, shape it into bricks using wooden molds, fire the bricks in large kilns, then transport them to the wall. The Ming Dynasty wall used massive quantities of bricks. Individual bricks weighed 20 to 40 pounds each. A single section of wall might require millions of bricks. The logistics of producing, transporting, and laying that many bricks boggle the mind. Entire towns sprang up around kiln sites, housing the workers who mined clay, shaped bricks, tended kilns, and loaded transport. Transporting bricks to mountain construction sites was its own nightmare. Workers carried them on their backs using wooden frames, climbing steep paths, sometimes forming human chains where bricks were passed from hand to hand up impossible slopes. There's a doubtful but persistent legend that goats were used to carry bricks, with bricks tied to their horns, though the practicality of this seems questionable. More likely, it was almost entirely human muscle moving those tons upon tons of material. The mortar technology of the Ming Dynasty was genuinely innovative. The famous sticky rice mortar used rice paste, glutinous rice cooked into a porridge-like consistency, mixed with lime to create a binding agent that was stronger and more water-resistant than earlier mortars. Modern chemical analysis has confirmed something that sounds impossible, but is absolutely true. This mortar can actually be stronger than pure lime mortar, creating bonds that have lasted for centuries with minimal degradation. Here's the science that makes this work. The sticky rice provided organic compounds, specifically amylopectin, a complex carbohydrate, that filled microscopic gaps in the mortar, creating a denser, less porous material. It also improved the mortar's workability, making it easier to apply in cold weather or challenging conditions. The technology was so effective that some Ming Dynasty mortars have proven more durable than modern concrete in certain environmental conditions, particularly in areas with frequent freeze-thaw cycles. Scientists testing 500-year-old mortar samples have found them to be nearly as strong today as when they were first applied, an achievement modern construction engineers study with genuine admiration. But here's the darker context. This technological marvel that we now study and celebrate was applied by workers who were literally starving. The rice that made such excellent mortar was rice that hungry workers couldn't eat. Imagine the bitter irony, mixing food into mortar while your own stomach is empty, creating structures that will last centuries while you're likely to die within months. That's the kind of contradiction that defines the Great Wall. Impressive engineering achieved through human misery. Ming walls were also more elaborate architecturally. Earlier walls had been simple barriers, essentially just vertical obstacles meant to slow attackers. Ming walls incorporated sophisticated defensive features, crenellations for archers, watchtowers positioned at regular intervals for surveillance and signaling, gates and passes with multiple defensive layers, and garrison structures where troops could be stationed. The watchtowers deserve special mention. Typically spaced at intervals where one tower could visually communicate with the next, usually a few miles apart, these towers served multiple functions. They housed soldiers who watched for enemy movements. They provided elevated positions for archery and other defensive actions. And crucially, they served as signal stations for a communication system based on beacon fires and smoke signals. The beacon signal system was sophisticated for its time. During the day, fires created smoke signals, different amounts of smoke indicating different levels of threat. At night, fires themselves served as signals, visible across long distances in the darkness. According to Ming Dynasty records, the number of smoke plumes or fires communicated specific information. One fire might mean a sighting of enemy scouts, 3 fires a larger force, 5 fires an invasion in progress. This system allowed warnings to travel hundreds of miles within hours, faster than any messenger could ride. The wall itself was typically built with brick or stone, facing on both the inner and outer sides, with the core filled with rammed earth, rubble, or whatever materials were conveniently available. This core and facing construction was efficient. The expensive manufactured bricks or carefully fitted stones only had to be used for the visible exterior, while the structural core could use cheaper materials. The result was walls that were impressively thick, often 15 to 25 feet wide at the base, and could withstand significant punishment. The top of the wall featured a paved pathway wide enough for troops to move along quickly, sometimes wide enough for horses or supply carts. Crenellations provided cover for defenders. Drainage systems prevented water from pooling and eroding the structure. The Ming Dynasty wall represented centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge applied with resources and organizational capacity that earlier dynasties couldn't match. But all of this innovation and sophistication came at a human cost that was, if anything, higher than earlier construction periods. Brick production required workers to labor in hot kilns, breathing smoke and dust. Transport required back-breaking carries up mountain slopes. The skilled masons needed for proper brickwork were in short supply. So many wall sections were built by unskilled conscripts who had to learn on the job, making mistakes that cost time, materials, and lives. The Ming Dynasty mobilized enormous numbers of workers for wall construction, especially after the Tumu crisis of 1449, when the Mongols decisively defeated a Ming army and captured the emperor. This military disaster shocked the Ming leadership into an even more defensive posture, and wall construction accelerated dramatically. At the peak of Ming construction efforts, it's estimated that nearly 1 in 3 adult males in some northern provinces was conscripted for wall duty. Different sections of the Ming Wall show remarkable variation in construction quality. Sections near Beijing, protecting the capital, were built to the highest standards with the best materials and most skilled workers. More remote sections, especially in the west, often used cruder construction techniques with less durable materials. This variation reflects practical reality. The Ming couldn't maintain the same construction standards across thousands of miles of wall, so they prioritized based on strategic importance. Modern archaeological work continues to reveal details about construction techniques. Recent excavations at the Jiangnu section of the Great Wall, for instance, have uncovered not just architectural elements, but also artifacts from daily life. Weapons including cannons, construction tools, everyday items like coins, even carbonized plant seeds that reveal what soldiers and workers ate. These discoveries provide glimpses into the lived reality of wall construction, adding detail and nuance to our understanding. The evolution from rammed earth to sophisticated brick construction represents a progression of engineering knowledge. But it also represents a consistent thread: societies willing to expend enormous human resources, lives really, in pursuit of security and imperial prestige. Whether built with earth or reeds or brick, whether constructed by the Qin or the Han or the Ming, the wall was always built with human suffering. The techniques changed, the materials improved, but the fundamental equation remained constant: stone and mortar mixed with blood and death, creating a monument that would outlast all the workers who built it. Social hierarchy and the machine of control. The Great Wall construction sites weren't chaotic masses of workers doing as they pleased. They were organized systems of strict hierarchy, enforced discipline, and brutal control. Understanding this social structure is crucial to understanding why workers couldn't simply refuse to work or walk away or organize resistance. The system was designed to extract maximum labor while preventing any collective action that might threaten operations. At the top of the hierarchy were imperial officials, civil servants and military officers appointed by the central government to oversee construction. These men were educated, often from wealthy or connected families, and they viewed the wall project as a duty to the emperor and an opportunity for career advancement. They didn't personally engage in construction labor. Their job was management, allocating resources, setting quotas, keeping records, reporting progress to the capital. Beneath the imperial officials were military commanders, generals and officers who managed large sections of wall construction. These were men with military training and experience, accustomed to commanding troops and expecting instant obedience. General Meng Jiangnu, who oversaw initial Qin Dynasty construction, was the most famous of these commanders. But there were hundreds of others over the centuries, each responsible for specific wall sections or construction phases. Below the commanders came the middle management, supervisors, foremen, and squad leaders. These men directly oversaw work crews, ensuring quotas were met, distributing rations, maintaining order. Many were soldiers who'd been assigned supervisory roles, though some were experienced workers promoted from the ranks. This middle tier was crucial to operations. They were the interface between the command structure and the mass of laborers, translating orders into action. At the bottom were the workers themselves, but even here there was hierarchy. Soldiers occupied the highest status among laborers. They were the emperor's men, serving a recognized duty, entitled to slightly better rations and treatment than civilians. They had defined terms of service, though these could be extended indefinitely, and at least a theoretical possibility of returning to regular military duties when construction was complete. Civilian conscripts were next in the hierarchy. These were the farmers, craftsmen, and merchants pulled from their homes for corvée labor. They had fewer rights than soldiers, but more than criminals. They weren't officially dishonored. Their families hadn't lost social standing because of their service. They could hope, however vainly, that after their term of forced labor, they might return home and resume normal lives. At the absolute bottom were the criminals, convicts sentenced to wall labor as punishment. These men had their heads shaved as marks of their status. They wore leg irons or other restraints, at least initially. They were assigned the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks. Guards felt free to beat them with impunity for any perceived infraction, or sometimes for no reason at all. Their lives were valued even less than other workers' lives, which is saying something given how little value was placed on human life generally. This hierarchy wasn't merely social convention, it was enforced policy with specific legal and practical implications. Soldiers received better rations, better shelter when it was available, and medical attention that other workers couldn't access. Civilians got standard rations and treatment. Criminals got whatever was left, if anything. The punishment system was brutal and arbitrary. Minor infractions, slowing down, talking back to supervisors, failing to meet daily quotas, were punished with beatings. Bamboo canes were the weapon of choice, applied to backs, shoulders, and legs, with enough force to cause pain and bruising, but usually not enough to prevent continued work. The logic was clear. Workers were valuable for their labor, so punishments couldn't render them completely unable to work, but they needed to be painful enough to deter future misbehavior. More serious infractions, attempting to escape, refusing to work, injuring or killing a supervisor, were punished with execution. Sometimes this was immediate. An overseer might simply order a worker killed on the spot for a major transgression, and other workers would be forced to carry out the execution as a demonstration of the consequences of resistance. Other times, executions were formal events, conducted in view of large numbers of workers to serve as deterrents. The threat of punishment extended beyond individual workers to their families, and this is where the system's cruelty becomes almost incomprehensible. Ming Dynasty records document a policy so brutal it's hard to believe it was real. If a criminal sentenced to wall labor died before completing his 4-year term, his family was required to send another male relative to finish the sentence. A brother, a son, a cousin. Someone had to replace the dead worker. Let that sink in. Your brother dies building the wall, starved, worked to death, broken by the system. And instead of mourning, instead of burying him and trying to recover from the loss, you receive orders. Report to the same construction site, do the same work that killed him, complete his sentence. The system treated human lives as interchangeable units of labor. If one unit broke, simply insert another. This policy ensured labor quotas were met while creating a psychological trap more effective than any physical chains. It meant that even death didn't end your family's obligation to the wall. It meant that attempting to escape or resist could bring catastrophe not just to you, but to everyone you loved. And it meant that the wall was consuming not just individuals, but entire lineages, multiple generations destroyed by a single period of conscription. The Ming Dynasty had particularly harsh policies. Records indicate that if a criminal sentenced to wall labor died before completing his 4-year term, his family was required to send another male to finish the sentence. Can you imagine? Your brother or father dies building the wall, and instead of mourning, you're conscripted to replace him, sent to the same place that killed your relative to do the same work that might kill you. Escape was nearly impossible and harshly punished. The construction sites were remote, often hundreds of miles from workers' home villages. You didn't know the terrain. You had no supplies, no resource, no way to navigate back to civilization. Guards patrolled regularly. And most damning, if you somehow did escape and made it home, officials would punish your family. Fines, property confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. This created a psychological trap. Even if you could physically escape, where would you go? What would happen to the people you love? Some workers did try to escape anyway. Desperation overcomes logic. Records mention fugitives from wall construction, usually captured within days and brought back for public punishment before being returned to work. The punishments were designed to be memorable: severe beatings, branding, increased workloads. The message was unmistakable. Resistance is futile, and attempting it only makes your situation worse. The system also employed rewards, though these were minimal compared to the punishments. Workers who consistently met or exceeded quotas might receive extra rations, a bit more grain, perhaps a small amount of salted meat or vegetables. Supervisors sometimes granted brief rest periods to crews that finished tasks ahead of schedule. These small carrots, combined with the large sticks of punishment, created a controlled environment where workers did what they were told because the alternative was clearly worse. Within work crews, informal hierarchies developed. Stronger workers, or those with useful skills, gained status among their peers. Men who could read or write might help others draft messages home, though sending them was usually impossible. Men with medical knowledge, however basic, became valuable for treating minor injuries. These informal roles provided small amounts of power and prestige in an environment where both were vanishingly rare. The system was psychologically sophisticated in its cruelty. By creating hierarchies among workers, soldiers better than civilians, civilians better than criminals, it prevented solidarity. Workers didn't see themselves as a unified group facing common oppression. They saw themselves as members of different status groups with different treatment and prospects. Soldiers might resent being reduced to manual labor, but they took some comfort in not being mere criminals. Civilians might suffer, but they weren't at the absolute bottom. This divide and rule strategy meant organized resistance was nearly impossible. Any attempt to organize would have to cross status boundaries, convincing soldiers and civilians and criminals that they had common cause despite the system actively emphasizing their differences. And even if you could build that solidarity, what would you do? You're hundreds of miles from population centers, surrounded by hostile terrain, facing armed guards and the full power of the imperial state. Rebellion would be suicide. The overseers understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. They promoted competition between work crews. Which group could move more stone, build faster, maintain better discipline? This competition further prevented cooperation. If your crew is trying to outperform another crew for marginal benefits, you're not thinking about solidarity with them. The psychological toll, based on what we can infer from historical accounts of similar forced labor conditions and the documented behaviors of wall survivors, was likely as crushing as the physical. You were stripped of autonomy, dignity, and individual identity. You weren't a person with a name and a story. You were a unit of labor, interchangeable with any other unit. Your individual qualities, your personality, your skills, your humanity were irrelevant, except insofar as they affected your ability to work. Historical records describing wall construction survivors and their difficulty reintegrating into normal life suggest that many workers adapted by becoming almost automaton-like in their responses to orders. Contemporary poems and folklore describe men who moved like ghosts or had death in their eyes even while living, phrases that suggest profound psychological trauma. You might do what you're told because thinking about it, questioning it, becomes too painful. The alternative, maintaining full consciousness of your situation, could lead to breakdown or suicide, both of which are documented in historical sources describing wall labor camps. After months or years on the wall, many workers were fundamentally changed psychologically. Even those who survived and returned home often found they couldn't readjust to normal life. They'd lived in a world of such concentrated brutality and suffering that ordinary village existence felt alien. They had nightmares, anger issues, difficulty connecting with family members who couldn't understand what they'd experienced. Today, we might recognize this as post-traumatic stress disorder. Then, it was just how survivors were. Broken men who'd seen too much and suffered too much to ever be whole again. The social control system of the Great Wall was, in its own terrible way, efficient. It extracted maximum labor from workers while preventing organized resistance, maintained order among huge populations of desperate men, and kept construction moving forward despite the horrific conditions. It was a machine designed to consume humans and produce stone barriers, and it worked exactly as intended for centuries. But efficiency, measured in miles of wall, says nothing about the moral cost. The system required viewing human beings as disposable resources. It required supervisors who could watch men suffer and die without intervening, who could inflict punishment without mercy, who could participate in a machine of destruction and call it duty. It required a society that valued imperial ambition more than individual human life, that could sacrifice hundreds of thousands of its own people for a defensive structure that, ultimately, didn't even work as intended. The wall never successfully prevented major invasions when determined enemies chose to attack. The hierarchy, the punishments, the psychological control, these were all features of a system built on fundamental devaluing of human life. And that, perhaps more than any physical hardship, is the darkest aspect of the Great Wall's history. It stands as a monument to human engineering capability, yes, but also as a monument to what humans are willing to do to each other when power flows in one direction and suffering is someone else's problem. Archaeological evidence. Voices from the stones. Here's something that might surprise you. Some of the most significant discoveries about the Great Wall's construction were made just weeks ago, as of late 2024 and into 2025. History isn't a closed book. We're still uncovering new evidence, still learning new details, still finding physical proof of experiences that written records barely documented. For most of the Great Wall's history, we knew about construction primarily through written records, imperial documents, historical chronicles, literary references. These sources told us about emperors and generals, about grand strategy and political decisions. But they told us relatively little about the actual workers who built the wall, the daily reality of their lives, the specific conditions they faced. Archaeology is changing that. Modern excavations at various wall sites are recovering physical evidence that fills in details written records missed or ignored. And some of these discoveries are remarkably recent, adding new layers to our understanding even as we approach 2025. One of the most significant recent excavations occurred at the Jiangnu section of the Great Wall in Beijing, completed in late 2025. This project represented the first time Chinese archaeologists employed an excavate while restoring approach, conducting systematic archaeological investigation alongside physical restoration work. The results were remarkable. More than 170 artifacts spanning the Ming Dynasty period, including military equipment, construction tools, and everyday objects that reveal intimate details about life on the wall. Among the most impressive finds was a large cannon cast during the late Ming Dynasty, measuring 89.2 centimeters in length and weighing 112.1 kilograms. This was the largest artillery piece ever discovered at the Jiangnu section. The cannon wasn't just a military artifact. Its well-preserved inscriptions provided crucial evidence about Ming-era firearms manufacturing techniques, including details about where and when it was cast, which officials were responsible for its production, and how military technology was shared between different garrison units. The cannon's discovery highlighted how the wall wasn't just a passive barrier, but an active military installation. Ming defenders had access to relatively sophisticated firearms, and they positioned them strategically along the wall to maximize defensive capability. Finding the cannon in its archaeological context, associated with a specific watchtower and construction layer, helps researchers understand how these weapons were integrated into the wall's defensive system. But the excavation also recovered smaller, more intimate artifacts that tell stories about the humans who lived and worked there. Archaeologists found carbonized plant seeds, the remnants of actual meals eaten by soldiers centuries ago. Some of these have been identified as grains: millet, wheat, barley. Analysis of how these seeds were preserved, charred by fire but not completely consumed, suggests outdoor cooking, perhaps around open fires where soldiers prepared their rations in simple cooking vessels. These seeds are extraordinary finds because they provide direct physical evidence of diet. We're not relying on written records saying soldiers received grain rations. We're looking at the actual grain they ate, preserved by chance for hundreds of years. Analysis can tell us not just what types of grain, but potentially where it came from, what time of year it was harvested, even details about agricultural practices of the period. The excavation also uncovered architectural elements, beast-shaped decorations that adorned watchtowers and gates, brick stamps indicating which workshops produced which bricks, foundation stones showing construction sequences. Each piece adds to the puzzle of how the wall was actually built, not the idealized version in imperial chronicles, but the messy, practical reality of construction. Weapons beyond the large cannon were found. Smaller firearms called Frankish machines, spears, arrows, pieces of armor. Each weapon type tells us something about the threats defenders expected and the tactics they employed. The presence of multiple weapon types suggests flexible defensive strategies, different weapons for different situations, from arrows for long-range harassment to hand weapons for close combat if enemies reached the wall itself. Construction tools provide insights into building techniques. Hammers, chisels, mallets, measuring devices. These weren't just generic tools, but specialized implements designed for specific tasks. Some show wear patterns indicating how they were used. Others show repairs, suggesting tools were valuable enough to fix rather than discard. The presence of certain tool types in certain layers helps archaeologists understand how construction methods evolved over time. Coins found at the site tell economic stories. Workers and soldiers were sometimes paid in cash, though often paid very little or not at all. And coins in archaeological layers reveal which periods saw cash payments, what denominations were used, and potentially where garrison members came from based on coin types. Finding coins alongside other artifacts helps date layers and associate objects with specific time periods. Recent excavations in Shandong province, announced in early 2025, revealed sections of the Qi Great Wall, one of the earliest wall sections, predating Qin Shi Huang's unified wall by several centuries. Radiocarbon dating and optically stimulated luminescence testing pushed the construction date back to the late Western Zhou Dynasty, around 771 BC, and early spring and autumn period, roughly 300 years earlier than previously thought. This discovery fundamentally changed our understanding of when defensive wall construction began in China. The Shandong excavation also uncovered residential remains beneath early wall sections, semi-subterranean dwellings with square foundations and rounded corners, suggesting small communities lived near these walls before or during construction. Finding pottery, tools, and other domestic artifacts in these dwellings provides evidence about who these people were and how they lived. Were they workers? Local villagers? Soldiers' families? The evidence is still being analyzed. About 1.5 kilometers from the Qi Great Wall, archaeologists identified remains of Pinyin City, an ancient settlement mentioned in historical texts as a critical Qi state stronghold. Excavation confirmed a western city wall at least 500 meters long, along with defensive trenches and fortified gates matching ancient descriptions. This discovery established that the wall functioned as part of a larger defensive network, including cities, roads, and garrison posts, not a stand-alone barrier, but an integrated military system. Archaeological work in western desert sections has used different techniques. Scientists collected samples of ancient reeds from Han Dynasty walls, built roughly 2,000 years ago, for molecular and isotope analysis. These analyses revealed that the reeds were phragmites, common reeds, harvested from local wetlands and oases, confirming written accounts about how desert walls were constructed with plant materials. But the isotope analysis went further, revealing information about ancient climate. By comparing carbon and nitrogen isotope ratios in ancient reeds versus modern ones, scientists reconstructed historical environmental conditions. What they found was surprising. The northwestern regions where the wall was built 2,000 years ago had more water and supported more vegetation than the arid deserts we see today. Significant hydrological changes occurred after the Song dynasty, meaning workers in ancient times had somewhat better access to water than the modern landscape suggests. Though somewhat better is relative when we're talking about semi-arid desert. These climate findings matter because they help explain how such massive construction projects were possible in regions that seem impossibly harsh today. Workers had access to local water source and forage that have since disappeared due to climate changes and human activities like deforestation and over-irrigation. No archaeological excavation has yet definitively confirmed human remains within the wall structure itself, despite the persistent legend of bodies being built into the walls. However, remains have been found buried near construction sites in positions suggesting hasty, informal interment. People who died and were buried quickly without ceremony in shallow graves near where they fell. These burials show evidence of malnutrition, disease, and traumatic injuries consistent with construction accidents. Analysis of skeletal remains provides direct evidence of the physical toll of wall construction. Bones show signs of extreme stress, compression fractures in vertebrae from heavy lifting, worn joints from repetitive labor, healed fractures that set badly because medical care was unavailable or inadequate. Teeth show evidence of severe nutritional deficiencies. Average heights and weights can be estimated from skeletal remains, and these suggest workers were significantly smaller and lighter than modern populations, the result of generations of poor nutrition. Some remains show traumatic injuries that were the immediate cause of death: crushed skulls from falling stones, broken backs from falls, severed limbs from construction accidents. These provide grim confirmation of what written records describe: the extreme danger of construction work where safety was never a consideration and human life was expendable. Archaeological research continues to evolve with new technologies. Ground-penetrating radar allows surveyors to map buried wall sections without excavating. Drone photogrammetry creates detailed 3D models of existing wall structures, helping researchers understand construction sequences and identify areas needing preservation. Remote sensing, using satellite imagery, tracks how the wall has deteriorated over time and identifies sections at risk of collapse. Isotope analysis of building materials can reveal where they came from, which quarries supplied stone, which forests provided timber, which rivers provided clay for bricks. This mapping of material sources helps reconstruct the logistics of construction, showing how vast the supply networks were and how much effort went into simply gathering and transporting materials. DNA analysis of ancient plant and animal remains found at sites can identify species and even specific strains, telling us about historical biodiversity and how humans impacted ecosystems through construction activities. Finding particular plant species in layers associated with specific time periods helps date the layers and understand environmental conditions. What emerges from all this archaeological evidence is a picture far richer than what written records alone could provide. We see not just the wall as a military and political project, but the wall as a lived space where humans struggled, ate, worked, suffered, and died. We see the tools they used, the food they ate, the weapons they wielded, the camps where they slept. We see evidence of their bodies broken by labor, their graves dug in haste, their possessions left behind when they died far from home. Archaeological discoveries provide something written records rarely do: empathy. When you stand in a museum looking at a carbonized grain seed from a Ming soldier's meal, or a broken hammer worn smooth by countless hands, or a cannon inscribed with the name of a long-dead artisan, the human reality becomes tangible in a way that statistics and chronicles can't capture. The work continues. Every year brings new excavations, new discoveries, new techniques for analysis. The Great Wall still has secrets to reveal about the people who built it and the lives they lived. And as we recover these stories from the earth and stones, we're fulfilling something like a moral obligation to remember. These were real people who suffered and died in service of imperial ambition. The least we can do is try to understand their stories and ensure they're not forgotten entirely. Their bones lie beneath the wall or near it. Their names are mostly lost, but archaeology gives them voice again, pulling their stories from the earth one artifact, one seed, one fragment at a time. The Ming Dynasty, building the wall we know when we picture the Great Wall of China today, that impressive grey serpent of brick and stone winding dramatically across mountain ridges. We're primarily seeing Ming Dynasty construction. The wall that draws millions of tourists annually, that appears in photographs and documentaries, that stands as the iconic image of Chinese civilization, was largely built or rebuilt during the Ming Dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644 AD. But why? Why did the Ming invest so heavily in wall construction when earlier dynasties had built walls, when the Mongol Yuan dynasty the Ming replaced had actually controlled both sides of the frontier, and therefore hadn't needed walls at all? The answer lies in a military disaster and the strategic recalculation it forced. The Ming dynasty was founded by Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant who rose to lead a successful rebellion against Mongol rule and established himself as the Hongwu Emperor in 1368. For the first several decades of Ming rule, the dynasty pursued an aggressive, offensive strategy toward the northern frontier. Ming armies regularly campaigned beyond the wall, pushing deep into Mongolian territory, seeking to destroy nomadic military power before it could threaten China. This offensive strategy was expensive, but seemingly effective. The Ming maintained forward garrisons in the steppe transitional zone, that grey area between settled agricultural land and pure nomadic grassland, where control was always contested. These garrisons required constant supply and reinforcement, but they extended Ming authority far beyond the old defensive walls and kept potential enemies off balance. Then came 1449 and the Tumu Crisis, a military catastrophe that shattered Ming military prestige and fundamentally changed strategic thinking. The Oirat Mongols, led by Esen Taishi, invaded near the Juyong Pass. The Ming court, underestimating the threat, dispatched an army of reportedly 500,000 men led by the Zhengtong Emperor Zhu Qijian personally. In the ensuing battle at Tumu, the Ming army was decisively defeated. Over half the Chinese force perished, and the emperor himself was captured. An unprecedented humiliation. The Tumu crisis revealed that the Ming military, despite its size and resources, couldn't guarantee security through offensive operations alone. The loss of so many soldiers and the capture of the emperor caused political chaos in Beijing. Only quick action by the Minister of War Yu Qian, who installed the emperor's brother as regent and organized Beijing's defense, prevented the Oirats from exploiting their victory to conquer the capital itself. The emperor was eventually returned in a prisoner exchange and promptly placed under house arrest by his brother, who had no intention of giving up the throne. But the strategic lesson was clear. The Ming couldn't project power into the steppe reliably enough to ensure security. They needed a defensive alternative. They needed walls. In the decades following the Tumu crisis, Ming strategic policy shifted decisively toward defense. The forward garrisons in the steppe were gradually abandoned as too expensive and vulnerable. Resources were redirected to fortification construction along the frontier itself, creating what would become the most extensive and sophisticated version of the Great Wall ever built. The Ming wall-building effort occurred in multiple phases over nearly 2 centuries, with different emperors prioritizing different sections based on changing threat assessments. The Jiajing Emperor Zhu Hokong, who ruled from 1521 to 1567, dramatically increased construction, focusing particularly on sections north of Beijing, where the capital was most vulnerable. Later emperors continued and expanded these efforts, creating a system that by the late Ming period included not just walls, but a comprehensive defensive network of passes, garrisons, signal towers, and supply depots. The Ming brought new resources and technologies to wall construction. Brick production became industrialized, with kilns operating at scales previously unknown. The development of better mortars, including the famous sticky rice mortar mixing rice paste with lime, created more durable structures. And the Ming had something earlier dynasties lacked: nearly 1,000 years of accumulated experience showing what worked and what didn't in wall construction. Ming sections typically featured brick or stone facing on both sides with an earthen or rubble core, creating walls 15 to 25 feet wide at the base and 15 to 30 feet high. The top featured a paved walkway wide enough for 5 horses to ride abreast, allowing rapid troop movement along the wall. Crenellations provided cover for defenders. Drainage systems prevented water damage. Watchtowers appeared every few hundred yards, serving as observation posts, signal stations, and defensive strongpoints. The passes, major fortified gates through the wall at strategic locations, were engineering marvels. Structures like Jiayu Pass in Gansu or Shanhai Pass, where the wall meets the sea, featured multiple defensive layers: outer walls, moats, barbicans, inner walls, gate towers, and garrison buildings. An attacking force would have to breach multiple barriers while under constant fire from defenders on walls and towers. The design reflected sophisticated understanding of military architecture and siege warfare. The signal system deserves special mention. Ming Dynasty watchtowers were equipped with standardized signal fires used to communicate along the length of the wall. During the day, smoke signals were used, different numbers of smoke plumes indicating different levels of threat. At night, fires served the same purpose. Records indicate specific meanings for different signals. 1 smoke fire meant enemy scouts detected, 3 meant a sizable enemy force, 5 meant an invasion underway with thousands of troops. This system allowed warnings to travel the length of the wall within hours, far faster than any messenger could ride. Guards at each tower would observe signals from neighboring towers and relay them along the line. In theory, a Mongol raid detected at the western end of the wall could be reported to Beijing within a day through this relay system, allowing the capital to mobilize defenses. The manpower requirements for Ming construction were staggering. At various points during peak construction periods, historians estimate that nearly 1 in 3 adult males in some northern provinces was conscripted for wall duty. The Ming maintained a military system that made soldiers responsible for wall construction and maintenance as part of their regular duties, ensuring a constant supply of at least minimally trained labor. The quality of Ming construction varied considerably depending on location and period. Sections protecting Beijing and other critical areas received the best materials, most skilled workers, and most careful supervision. These sections, like Badaling and Mutianyu, were built to the highest standards and remain impressively preserved today. More remote sections, especially in the far west, often received less attention and were built more crudely. Ming Dynasty records provide much better documentation than earlier periods, giving us relatively detailed information about costs, labor requirements, and logistics. We know, for instance, that at certain points the Ming maintained over 25,000 watchtowers along the wall, an almost incomprehensible number requiring enormous resources to staff and supply. We know that the wall system was divided into 9 defense areas, each commanded by a garrison general responsible for his section's maintenance and defense. We also know that despite all this investment, the wall failed its primary purpose. It never successfully prevented a determined enemy from invading when they chose to. The Manchu invasion that eventually toppled the Ming Dynasty and established the Qing didn't go through the wall. They went around it, entering through Shanhai Pass after a Ming general defected and opened the gates. Even during the Ming period, Mongol raids regularly breached the wall through various means, bribing guards, finding unmanned sections, climbing over with ropes and ladders, or simply waiting for winter when parts of the wall became impassable and guards abandoned their posts. The wall's real function was more complex than simply keeping nomads out. It served as a military highway, allowing rapid troop deployment along the frontier. It provided psychological reassurance to Chinese populations and officials who could see physical barriers between themselves and threats. It was a jobs program that employed millions and redistributed resources. It was a symbol of imperial power and commitment to defense. In all these secondary functions, it arguably succeeded, even if it failed at the primary goal of making northern borders impenetrable. By the late Ming period, the wall was also becoming economically problematic. The costs of maintaining thousands of miles of fortification, supplying garrisons, and keeping the signal system functional were enormous. As the Ming Dynasty declined into chaos from internal rebellions, government corruption, and fiscal crisis, wall maintenance suffered. Sections fell into disrepair. Guards went unpaid and sometimes abandoned their posts. Now, remember that question from the beginning? The one I told you to keep in the back of your mind. It's time for the answer that recontextualizes everything you've just heard. All that suffering. Every broken body, every starved worker, every family destroyed, every name erased, every million deaths was for a wall that never actually worked. Let me say that again, because it's important. The Great Wall of China, in its stated primary purpose of keeping invaders out, was a complete and utter failure. Despite all the death, despite the million dead, despite centuries of construction and maintenance and human sacrifice on a scale almost incomprehensible, the Great Wall failed spectacularly at its supposed mission. Throughout the Ming period, when the wall was at its most sophisticated and well-maintained, Mongol raids regularly breached it through various means, bribing guards, who were often unpaid and desperate, finding unmanned sections, climbing over with ropes and ladders, or simply waiting for winter when parts became impassable and guards abandoned their posts to avoid freezing to death. The wall was breached so routinely that Ming military commanders developed entire strategies that assumed the wall would be crossed. The fortification wasn't a barrier, it was a speed bump. It slowed invaders down, maybe bought a little time for warnings to spread, but it never stopped anyone who was actually determined to get through. And when the ultimate test came, when the Manchu invasion finally toppled the Ming Dynasty and established the Qing in 1644, the Manchus didn't go through the wall or over it or under it. A Ming general named Wu Sangui, angry at the Ming court for various grievances and believing the dynasty was doomed anyway, simply opened the gates at Shanhai Pass and let the Manchu army walk through. The greatest military fortification in human history, built at a cost of over 1 million lives across multiple dynasties, spanning more than 2,000 years of construction, representing the suffering of countless millions more who survived but were broken by the experience, was ultimately defeated by one man opening a door. Think about that. Really think about it. Every story you've heard tonight, Li Wei torn from his family, workers dying of starvation and disease, the 10% mortality rate, the family replacement policies, the children conscripted, the bodies buried in shallow graves, The women who feared having sons, the poems lamenting the dead, the legends of Meng Jiangnu weeping. All of that, every atom of suffering, was in service of creating a barrier that never successfully stopped a determined invasion when it mattered most. The wall's real functions turned out to be almost entirely symbolic and economic rather than military. A jobs program, a message of imperial power, a way to control trade, a military highway for troop movement, a psychological reassurance to populations who could see physical barriers between themselves and threats. All important functions, perhaps, but not worth 1 million dead. Nothing is worth 1 million dead, especially not something that didn't even accomplish its stated goal. During the Qing period, much of the wall was simply abandoned. Sections fell apart from lack of maintenance, eroded by wind and rain, looted for building materials by local populations. By the 20th century, significant portions had been reduced to earthen mounds barely recognizable as having once been fortifications. The dramatic stone and brick sections we see today mostly represent Ming construction that either survived by chance or was restored in modern times. The modern preservation and restoration of the Great Wall began in earnest in the 1950s and accelerated in the 1980s when the Chinese government recognized the wall's value as a national symbol and tourist attraction. Sections near Beijing were carefully restored, sometimes perhaps too carefully. Some critics argue that restorations made the wall look too new, like a Hollywood set, rather than an authentic ancient structure. The Great Wall was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987, recognizing both its historical significance and its status as an engineering achievement. Today it draws over 10 million visitors annually, generating significant tourism revenue and serving as perhaps the most recognizable symbol of China globally. But as we admire the Ming Dynasty wall's impressive appearance and sophisticated construction, we should remember what it represents, not just engineering triumph, but centuries of human suffering. The beautiful stonework was laid by workers in conditions we've explored in previous sections. The towering walls represent lives consumed in their building. The preservation and restoration efforts, while important for historical memory, can sometimes obscure the darker truth of what these stones cost and what they represent. The Ming Dynasty created the Great Wall we know today. They brought unprecedented resources, technology, and organizational capacity to the project. They built walls that have lasted centuries and continue to inspire awe. But they also perpetuated a system that viewed human beings as expendable resources in service of imperial total ambition. The wall they built is magnificent. The cost in human suffering was appalling. Both truths can coexist, and both deserve remembering. Cultural impact. How memory shapes stone. The Great Wall exists in two forms. There's the physical structure, stone and brick and earth snaking across mountains and deserts. And there's the cultural wall, the layer of meaning, myth, and memory that humans have wrapped around the physical structure, transforming it from a military fortification into a symbol carrying much greater weight. This cultural wall is complex and sometimes contradictory. In different periods and for different people, the Great Wall has meant different things: glorious achievement or wasteful tragedy, protection or oppression, symbol of strength or monument to fear. Understanding these shifting meanings helps us understand how societies remember and process their histories, especially histories containing as much suffering as the wall's construction. The earliest cultural response to the Great Wall was overwhelmingly negative, at least among common people and critical intellectuals. During the Qin Dynasty, when Qin Shi Huang was building the first unified wall, the human cost was immediate and visible. Families lost sons, husbands, fathers. Villages were depopulated. Entire regions suffered from labor shortages affecting agriculture and economic life. The response was bitterness and resentment. This resentment found expression in literature and folklore. During the Han Dynasty, following the Qin, a poem explicitly warned against having sons because boys would be taken for wall construction. If a son is born, mind you don't raise him. If a girl is born, feed her dried meat. Don't you just see beside the long wall? Dead men's skeletons prop each other up. This verse, attributed to the Han period, captures the profound social disruption the wall caused, families actively preferring daughters to sons because sons meant conscription and likely death. Later poems and folk songs continued this theme. A Song Dynasty poem described the wall as built with the bones of dead peasants, literalizing the metaphorical truth that the wall was constructed on human suffering and death. These weren't celebratory verses praising imperial achievement. They were laments, criticisms, expressions of grief and anger at what the wall had cost ordinary people. The most famous cultural response to the wall's human cost is the legend of Meng Jiangnu's bitter weeping, now counted as one of China's 4 great folk tales. The story, which exists in numerous variations that evolved over more than 2,000 years, tells of a woman whose husband was conscripted for wall construction. After months without word, she undertook a perilous journey to find him. When she reached the wall, she learned he had died and been buried in its foundations. According to the legend, her grief was so profound, her weeping so bitter, that a section of the wall collapsed, revealing her husband's bones so she could properly bury them. The legend's origins trace back to a much earlier, simpler story in the Zuo Zhuan, a chronicle from the spring and autumn period, 770–476 BC, which predates the Great Wall itself by centuries. That original story involved a warrior's wife insisting on proper funeral rites. Over time, as the Great Wall became associated with suffering and imperial cruelty, the story merged with wall construction narratives and evolved into the version we know today. The legend of Meng Jiangnu became culturally powerful, not because it was literally true. Archaeological evidence doesn't support bodies being built into the wall structure, but because it captured a metaphorical truth about the wall's human cost. It personalized abstract suffering, giving a face and a name to the countless families destroyed by wall construction. Meng Jiangnu became a symbol for all the wives who lost husbands, mothers who lost sons, and children who grew up without fathers. But the legend also reflects a certain futility. Meng Jiangnu's weeping can collapse a wall section and reveal her husband's body, but she can't bring him back. She can't undo the loss. Her act of resistance, if we can even call it resistance, changes nothing about the system that caused her suffering. The wall continues. Other men continue dying. The legend acknowledges suffering but offers no path to ending it, which perhaps reflects the powerlessness common people felt in the face of imperial demands. Interestingly, there's no archaeological evidence for bodies being built into the wall structure itself. The legend is metaphorical rather than literal, but that doesn't diminish its cultural power. The metaphor captures a deeper truth. The wall was built on death, funded by human lives, constructed from suffering as much as from stone. Whether bodies are physically in the wall is less important than the reality that the wall represents countless lost lives. Over time, as the centuries passed and the immediate suffering faded from living memory, the cultural meaning of the wall began to shift. By the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD, which ruled from the south and often had tenuous control over northern territories, the wall became associated with frontier defense and national boundaries. It was a line between Chinese civilization and the barbarian north, a physical manifestation of cultural identity. This shift continued during the Ming Dynasty. when the wall was being actively expanded and fortified. Ming intellectuals increasingly framed the wall positively, as necessary protection against nomadic threats. Official documents and histories emphasized the wall's defensive function and strategic importance, while downplaying or ignoring the human costs. The wall became associated with stability, security, and imperial strength. But critical voices persisted. During the 20th century, as China underwent revolutionary upheavals and grappled with questions of tradition versus modernity, the wall became a site of contested meaning. The New Culture movement and May 4th movement of the 1910s and 1920s, which sought to modernize China and break from oppressive traditions, often used the wall as a symbol of backwards thinking and autocratic excess. Lu Xun, one of China's most influential modern writers, harshly criticized what he called the mighty and accursed Great Wall in essays that questioned whether it had ever served any useful purpose beyond making countless workers labor to death in vain. He wrote, "It surrounds everyone," suggesting the wall represented not just a physical barrier, but a psychological one. Traditional thinking that imprisoned Chinese minds and prevented progress. During this period, the wall's symbolic meaning became explicitly negative for many intellectuals and revolutionaries. It stood for the old China, autocratic, wasteful, built on exploitation of peasants, obsessed with division and defense rather than openness and progress. Some went so far as to argue the wall should be dismantled entirely, that China needed to tear down both literal and metaphorical walls to join the modern world. Then came the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945, and the wall's meaning shifted again dramatically. During the 1933 defense of the Great Wall, Chinese soldiers fought desperately against Japanese invasion forces at passes like Shifengkou and Gubeiku. They were outmanned and outgunned, but they held out for months, inflicting significant casualties on Japanese forces before being overwhelmed. These battles transformed the wall in cultural imagination from a symbol of backwardness to a symbol of resistance and national spirit. The defense of the wall became a powerful narrative of Chinese determination in the face of aggression. Popular songs of the period referenced the wall, and China's national anthem literally includes the line, "Arise, all those who don't want to be slaves, let our flesh and blood forge our new Great Wall." This metaphorical wall, built from Chinese courage and sacrifice rather than stone, represented collective resistance to foreign domination. After the communist victory in 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic, the wall's cultural meaning evolved yet again. Early communist attitudes were ambivalent. On one hand, the wall represented feudal oppression, emperors exploiting peasants for vanity projects. On the other hand, it was an achievement of Chinese civilization and a symbol of historical continuity the new government wanted to claim. During the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, the wall suffered significant damage. Red Guards, intent on destroying the four olds, old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas, viewed the wall as part of the feudal past to be eliminated. Sections were deliberately destroyed using explosives and quarrying machines, the materials salvaged for new construction. Mao Zedong himself encouraged this destruction, viewing the wall as representing division and the old order. But by the 1980s, as China began opening to the world and seeking economic development, the wall was rediscovered as a valuable national symbol and tourist attraction. Deng Xiaoping initiated the Love Our China and Restore Our Great Wall campaign, mobilizing resources for preservation and restoration. The wall was reframed as a source of national pride, evidence of Chinese engineering capability, organizational power, and historical significance. This is largely the cultural meaning the wall carries today, at least in official narratives and tourist marketing. It's celebrated as a wonder of the world, a testament to human achievement, a symbol of Chinese civilization's longevity and resilience. The sections near Beijing are carefully maintained, attracting millions of visitors who come to walk the ancient fortifications and take selfies against dramatic mountain backdrops. But this celebratory narrative exists alongside other, more critical understandings. Historians and archaeologists continue to research and publicize the human costs of construction. Museums and educational materials increasingly acknowledge the suffering involved, though often in sanitized language that doesn't fully capture the horror. There's a tension between wanting to celebrate the wall as achievement and needing to remember it as tragedy. The wall has also become a global symbol in ways that sometimes have little to do with historical reality. In Western imagination, the Great Wall is often the first thing people think of when they think of China, more recognizable even than the Forbidden City or terracotta warriors. It appears in films, advertisements, video games, as shorthand for ancient China or Chinese culture generally. This global symbolic weight transforms the wall into a kind of universal icon that transcends its specific history. Modern Chinese nationalism has embraced the wall as a core symbol of national identity. The phrase "Budao Chang Cheng Fei Hao Yi, Budao Chang Cheng Fei Hao Han," one who fails to reach the Great Wall is not a hero, reflects this cultural meaning. Visiting the wall becomes a patriotic act, a way of connecting with Chinese heritage and proving one's commitment to national identity. School groups are taken on educational trips to the wall. Military units visit as part of training and morale building. The wall serves a contemporary political and cultural function quite different from its original military purpose. At the same time, the physical wall continues degrading. Climate change brings more extreme weather that accelerates erosion. Human activities, tourism, vandalism, theft of bricks for building materials, damage sections. Nearly 90% of the wall is at risk of collapse or has already disappeared. There's a race between preservation efforts and natural decay, with preservation often losing. The meaning of the wall will continue evolving. Each generation reinterprets historical events through its own values and concerns. Future generations might emphasize different aspects: climate resilience, labor rights, the ethics of large-scale projects, the relationship between security and openness. The stones themselves remain, mostly, constant, but the stories we tell about them and the meanings we assign to them shift with changing times. What's important is that we hold multiple meanings simultaneously. Yes, the wall is an impressive engineering achievement that required organizational capacity and technical knowledge. And yes, it was built through exploitation and suffering on a massive scale that destroyed countless lives. Both can be true. Acknowledging one doesn't diminish the other. The cultural wall, the layer of meaning and memory we've built around the physical structure, will outlast the physical wall. Long after the last stones have crumbled, the idea of the Great Wall will persist, a symbol complex enough to contain glory and tragedy, achievement and suffering, pride and shame. That complexity is itself a kind of monument, a monument to the way humans struggle to make sense of history and find meaning in the terrible things we do to each other. Conclusion: the price we're still paying. We've walked together through the entire experience of building the Great Wall of China, from the moment of conscription when your life ended and became labor, through the brutal daily reality of stone and suffering, to the archaeological evidence that preserves fragments of stories in carbonized seeds and broken tools. We've examined the climate that killed, the hierarchy that controlled, the methods that evolved, and the meanings humans have assigned to this massive structure. Now, at the end of this journey, let me give you the twist that recontextualizes everything. This isn't really a story about the past. It's a story about right now. Return to the question we asked at the beginning. Could you last a day building the Great Wall of China? Not the sanitized tourist version with guardrails and concession stands, but the real thing. The blood and exhaustion and hunger and fear that defined daily existence for millions of workers across centuries of construction. The honest answer for almost everyone living today is no. Not because we're weaker or less capable than our ancestors, but because the conditions were genuinely beyond what most humans can endure, even with the extreme adaptation and resilience our species is capable of demonstrating. Most workers didn't last. The 10% mortality rate during intensive construction periods means that roughly 1 in 10 workers died within a year. If the higher estimates of 40 to 50% mortality over longer periods are accurate, that means nearly half of everyone conscripted for wall duty never went home. But here's the real question, the one that should make you uncomfortable. What are we still building with human suffering? What monuments are we creating today where human cost is calculated and accepted? What massive projects proceed because the people with power have decided that certain lives are expendable in service of larger goals? I'm not asking this hypothetically. I'm asking you to think about it right now. The smartphone or computer you're watching this on, do you know the conditions under which its components were manufactured? The clothes you're wearing? Do you know who made them and what their working conditions were like? The infrastructure in your city? Do you know what happened to the workers who built it? The specific technology and social systems have changed since the Ming Dynasty. But the fundamental dynamic, ambition trumping welfare, results prioritized over lives, suffering accepted as the cost of progress, still appears in various forms worldwide. Massive infrastructure projects in various countries still see workers die at rates that would shock anyone who believed human life was truly valued equally. According to recent reports from international labor organizations, thousands of migrant workers die annually on construction projects in various nations, often in conditions that eerily echo what we've described tonight. Extreme heat, inadequate safety measures, insufficient food and water, lack of medical care, wages withheld, inability to leave. Supply chains for our consumer goods still involve labor practices that would be recognizable to Great Wall workers. People trapped in systems they can't escape, working exhausting hours for insufficient pay, suffering because someone else's profit or prestige or project depends on their suffering being acceptable. We still build monuments, both literal and economic, on foundations of human suffering we prefer not to examine too closely. We've just gotten better at hiding it, at ensuring the suffering happens far enough away that we don't have to see it, at creating enough layers of separation that we can honestly say we didn't know, even though we could know if we chose to look. Understanding this history matters for several reasons. First, it reminds us what humans are capable of, both in terms of incredible engineering achievements and terrible cruelty. The Great Wall represents the apex of ancient construction capability, a monument to organizational power and technical knowledge. But it also represents what happens when power is concentrated and human life is valued cheaply, when laborers are viewed as resources to be extracted and discarded rather than as people with inherent worth and dignity. Second, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of glory. We celebrate the Great Wall as a wonder of the world, and in many ways it deserves that celebration. But that celebration comes with an obligation to remember what it cost and whose suffering paid for it. When we admire the wall's beauty or post photographs from our tourist visits, we're standing on stone laid by men who were worked to death, whose families were destroyed, whose suffering was considered acceptable in service of imperial ambition. This isn't meant to make you feel guilty for appreciating the wall's historical and architectural significance. But it should complicate that appreciation, adding layers of moral complexity to how we think about great monuments and grand achievements. Almost every impressive ancient structure, the pyramids of Egypt, the Colosseum in Rome, the Angkor Wat complex in Cambodia, was built with forced labor and human suffering. That doesn't mean we should stop valuing these structures, but it does mean we should remember them as complex monuments that embody both human capability and human cruelty. Third, examining the Great Wall's history has contemporary relevance. Even today, massive infrastructure projects sometimes replicate elements of the Great Wall's labor dynamics. Workers in dangerous conditions with inadequate safety measures, projects where human cost is subordinated to completion schedules and cost targets. Systems where the powerful benefit while the powerless suffer. The specific technology and social systems have changed, but the fundamental dynamic, ambition trumping welfare, results prioritized over lives, still appears in various forms. Understanding historical precedents like the Great Wall helps us recognize and critique these patterns when they emerge in modern contexts. It gives us language and frameworks for talking about labor exploitation, the ethics of large-scale projects, and the question of what costs are acceptable in pursuit of development or security or national prestige. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it certainly echoes, and learning to hear those echoes helps us make better choices. Fourth, this history reminds us of the value of individual human stories in the face of overwhelming statistics. It's easy to become numb to numbers. 1 million dead over centuries of construction is a statistic so large it becomes almost abstract. But every one of those million deaths was a person, someone with a name and a family and hopes and fears. Someone who woke up one morning not knowing it would be their last day. Someone whose absence devastated people who loved them. The carbonized grain seeds archaeologists found at Jiangnu represent meals eaten by actual humans who lived and worked and suffered and died. The broken tools show wear patterns from specific hands gripping them. History isn't just dates and dynasties and policies. It's the accumulation of billions of individual human experiences, most of which leave no trace beyond their contribution to events and structures that outlast them. When we study the Great Wall, we're not just learning about engineering and empire. We're connecting, however imperfectly, with the lived reality of people separated from us by centuries, but connected to us by shared humanity. Finally, understanding the wall's history offers perspective on what we're capable of enduring and achieving, both individually and collectively. The workers who built the wall didn't have choices we take for granted. They couldn't refuse conscription or quit difficult jobs or move to places with better opportunities. They were trapped by systems that saw them as tools rather than people. And yet, they endured. They kept working, kept surviving when they could, kept finding small moments of humanity and connection, even in the bleakest conditions. Their endurance isn't something to romanticize. Suffering doesn't ennoble anyone, and there's nothing virtuous about being forced to endure impossible conditions. But their persistence does testify to something fundamental about human resilience, about our species' stubborn refusal to simply give up even when every rational calculation says there's no hope. That quality has carried humanity through countless horrors across history. It's not something to celebrate in the sense of saying, good that they suffered so much, but it is something to acknowledge and respect. The Great Wall stands today, more than 2,000 years after construction began, more than 300 years after the last major additions were made by the Ming Dynasty. It stretches across mountains and deserts, visited by millions, endlessly photographed and discussed and mythologized. It has outlasted the emperors who commanded its building, the dynasties that maintained it, and nearly all the workers who died creating it. But it won't last forever. Climate change accelerates erosion. Human activities cause damage. Nearly 90% of the wall's sections are at risk. Eventually, possibly within the next few centuries, the physical structure will crumble completely, returning to the earth from which it was raised. All that will remain will be the stories, the ones we choose to tell about what this structure meant and what it cost. The stories we're telling right now, in this moment, as you listen to these words. When the last stones finally fall, when future archaeologists dig through rubble trying to reconstruct what this massive structure looked like and meant, what will we want them to know? Here's my answer. Tell them everything. Tell them about the engineering marvel and the million dead. Tell them about the strategic brilliance and the families destroyed. Tell them about the wall as symbol of civilization and as reminder of what humans do to each other when power flows one direction and suffering is always someone else's problem. The Great Wall is many things simultaneously. A monument to human engineering capability, a scar marking where civilizations collided, a cemetery without markers, a tourist attraction, a symbol of national identity, a climate change case study, an archaeological treasure. All these identities are true. The wall is strong enough to bear the weight of contradiction. But here's the final twist, the one that should haunt you. You wouldn't last a day building the Great Wall of China. Neither would I. Neither would most people. Yet millions did last. Not just a day, but weeks, months, sometimes years, before their bodies or minds broke or death claimed them. Their endurance, forced though it was, built one of humanity's most recognizable monuments. The least we can do, the absolute minimum we owe those million dead whose names we'll never know, is remember them honestly. Not as noble builders of wonders, but as human beings who suffered and died because systems valued monuments more than lives. And then ask ourselves, what are we building right now that future generations will look back on with the same horror? What suffering are we accepting as the cost of progress? Whose names don't we know because we've decided not to learn them? The stones of the Great Wall are crumbling, but the lessons encoded in those stones about what humans are capable of achieving and what we're capable of inflicting on each other in pursuit of achievement, those lessons should outlast the structure itself. You wouldn't last a day, but now you understand why. And that understanding, multiplied across everyone who learns this history, might be the truest monument we can build. Not one of stone, but one of memory and moral reckoning. If this exploration meant something to you, share it. The algorithm loves engagement, sure, but more importantly, these stories need telling. The dead deserve remembering. And the living deserve to understand what their monuments actually cost. Sleep well, but remember, history is never just about the past. It's always, ultimately, about what we choose to do with what we know.